Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Kill Your Heroes in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 61. Hireth, Part 2. There was food waiting when she finally emerged from the bath. Itake had apparently anticipated her desire to escape from her real-world problems for as long as possible and provided a meal that was still delicious at room temperature. MREs provided the requisite calories, but that was about all that could be said for them. Of course, context played a part of one's enjoyment of food, and despite their history, eating with Itake was far, far better than eating in the ruins of her home. The devastation of Konohagakure and Suzuki's continued idiocy, it seemed safe to assume that if that had changed, Itake would have mentioned it. Made casual conversation a minefield that Sakura wasn't eager to attempt to navigate, no matter what she'd told Kakashi-senpai. Even Itake seemed reduced to patient silence, at least until Sakura had finished eating and was sipping at her tea in lieu of speaking to her companion. "This brings back memories," he said. "Except I usually have less clothes on by this point." Sakura choked on her tea, her blush instantaneous and scorching. Please, do not say something like that anywhere near Kakashi-senpai. He'd never let me hear the end of it." His subtle smile promised that he would absolutely do such a thing, and Sakura groaned, setting her cup down in favor of scrubbing her hands through her hair. Her fingers tangled, of course, since maintaining a hair care regimen hadn't been high on her list of priorities or even high on the list of possibilities, and she'd rushed through combing it when she'd gotten out of the bath. Unlike Itake, whose hair had been unfairly nice even as his body failed him or when he was inches from death, hers required careful tending. It was coarse and tended to be dry, like Kakashi-senpai's, which meant that it also tried to look like Kakashi-senpai's. She thought for a moment that Itake was going to do something ridiculous, like offer to brush her hair, because there was a strange, uncertain sort of look on his face and his hand had twitched upward when she'd stood to retrieve her comb. Which was odd, because Itake had an enviable certainty even when it came to impossible things. "Would you like to watch something? Or were you intending to sleep?" he asked. Sakura peered at him narrowly. "I remember a distinct lack of televisions in all our accommodations. I thought besides the work-related smut, you probably only read edifying and improving literature and shunned the entertainment of the masses. I can't tell if you're teasing me or not, though I'm glad, if you are. As flattering as it is that you've taken the time to consider my personal habits, I think you're giving me a little too much credit." Sakura arched her eyebrows at him as she tugged the comb through her hair, drawing up her bare feet beneath her on the couch. This made that subtle smile tug further at the edges of his lips, his eyes soft and almost laughing. "Though I do have standards," he allowed. "I'd hope so," she replied. "All right. Let's see if we can't find something to watch. Make it entertaining, Uchiha-san." "Define entertaining," he replied. This time he was definitely laughing. Death had freed her, it seemed to have done the same for Itake. "It shouldn't make me think too hard and no one dies," Sakura said firmly. "Also, I don't have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy. I don't find stupid funny." "I don't think I found stupid funny even when I was 12, Itake commented as he began flicking through the channels. They found a drama that satisfied all of Sakura's requirements, though she was slightly appalled to privately think that the male lead would probably be more attractive if she was sharing the couch with someone else. Though she relaxed somewhat into the conversation as they both took to gleefully pointing out flaws in the common sense of the characters. Well, she was doing it gleefully and Itake was doing it with slightly less vehemence but no less enjoyment. She didn't lose her awareness of him. It wasn't just that he was an attractive man with his feet bare and his hair loose, either. Some things bound you tighter than blood and maybe even sex, but she didn't know what to do with what they'd done. She'd thought of Sasori as evil, then she'd become Sasori for no better reason than because one man couldn't admit that his little brother was out of control and needed to be stopped. Sakura had coped with that last mission together by compartmentalizing, because she'd been incapable of rationalizing or justifying it to herself. If she tried rationalizing it, she had to accept that she had done and would do worse things with her genjutsu. She'd made Suzuki murder his mother and she didn't need Sasori's jutsu or Itake's directive or Tsunade-sama's orders to be a monster. If she tried justifying it, she had to accept that she found a life worth less than pacifying Itake, because she didn't believe the stranger's death would bring Suzuki back into the fold. She was Comfortable was not the right word, but she wasn't morally conflicted about killing to defend her village, her client, or her person. She was not so ethically certain about her role in the attack. A gambit. Operation Headhunter had given her little time and less incentive to endlessly revisit what it felt like to make a man a meat puppet. It was hard not to think about that mission with him so close. She'd only have to uncurl her legs to brush against him. The lure of trying to talk it out to confront him again about why he believed in Sasuke was powerful. She didn't, though, because she knew she would make it a confrontation and not a discussion, and she had to work with him after this. When the program ended, she suggested that she'd like to go to sleep. There were 2 beds and a pull-out cot in the couch, the latter of which Itaka would be taking. Sakura had suggested that since they were respecting seniority and it was strange to have someone like Uchiha Itaka being deferential to Hatake-senpai when familiarity had eroded all her formality with Kakashi-senpai, that she be the one to take the cot, but when not in the field Itaki had manners that, while she wouldn't call them old-fashioned, involved a great deal of host courtesy even in rented rooms. And that meant she got the bed. Now that he wasn't slowly suffocating, Itaka slept very quietly. She welcomed it after so long, packed into makeshift accommodations and luxuriated in cool, clean sheets. She expected nightmares, but her own sleep was restful, broken only once when Kakashi-senpai returned. She'd half dozed off again before the click of the bathroom door dragged her back into partial wakefulness, but she only murmured a second goodnight and hardly heard his reply. She didn't quite feel like a new person come morning, but she felt immeasurably readier to deal with whatever the day confronted them with. "So, Iron," Jiraiya-sama said as they sat down to breakfast. He'd only grinned when Kakashi-senpai had thanked him for the warning about their newest associate, and Sakura had half thought that senpai would retaliate by getting lost between the hotel and the restaurant. Even without the summit, their borders are well patrolled, despite the fact that it's frigid and no one in their right mind wants to spend any more time there than they absolutely have to. Its mines make its nobles wealthy, its weather and its standing military make it basically unassailable. Sounds like fun, doesn't it, kiddos? With this team, I'm worried more about coping with the weather than the border crossing, was Kakashi-senpai's reply. Even chakra circulation will only do so much. Which is why we're not going to be camping. Iron isn't a closed country. It depends too much on trade for that. Their growing season is short and there aren't many crops they can withstand the conditions. They do herd things like yaks and reindeer and other massive furry animals, and there's some fishing, but their population is too large to support with what they can produce domestically. So their samurai are severe, but their merchants are enthusiastic. Their mines might make their nobility wealthy, but everyone else needs to be able to buy rice. They've even gotten a little into tourism. Which is why we'll be there. Ever had a burning desire to go ice fishing? Not so much, no, Kakashi-senpai replied dryly. Itaka-san. Sakura. Nope, Sakura volunteered. I am happy to support local fishermen by buying them already out of the water. They all turned expectantly to Itaka. I concur with Sakura. Fish markets are more interesting than fishing. So that's a no on the ice fishing. Well, they have a well-developed reputation for jewelry. Konohagakure hasn't seen the trend emerge there yet, but you could pick up an Earth Country tradition and be picking out rings for your bride, he said, eyes sliding from Itaka to Sakura. The bride is going to nix that one, Sakura said. We don't know how long the conference is going to last, and while I'm not opposed to jewelry or anything, I'm not spending any substantive amount of time fussing over finding the absolutely perfect ring. Aside from annoying even myself, I don't know enough about the trends to sell the disguise. It's too bad that they don't allow civilians access to their sword-making industry. Their blades are supposed to be excellent. I think time spent watching their native swordsmiths at work would be very interesting, Itaka agreed. Despite their purpose, there is an undeniable beauty to a well-forged sword. Perhaps they have museums. As an important part of their culture, they might have well-known examples on display. She caught Jiraiya-sama rolling his eyes. You were the one who suggested ice fishing. When I do cultural tourism, my goal is to get closer to the people. So, festivals, bars, and women. Kakashi-senpai jibed. Hey, don't knock it. People aren't their high culture. You can't find the real spirit of a nation in museums. It lives and breathes and grows. It isn't something you can cage behind glass and write a placard on. That is perhaps the most high-minded argument for talking women into bed that I've ever heard, Itaka murmured to Sakura, who snorted. I noticed you weren't surprised by your marriage to Itaka, Kakashi-senpai observed. Despite what she'd said to Itaka last night, the lure proved too great to resist. I knew I'd have to make an honest man of him eventually. He used to tell me he'd lie awake at night, breathless, thinking that he'd die if I didn't come back to him whenever I had to leave. When we were together, I couldn't keep my hands off of him. My mother always said that a wedding should be demanded in recompense for surrendering one's body, Itaki added blandly. Kakashi-senpai blinked at them. Aren't the two of you adorable? I take it I'm the ferociously doting elder brother who refuses to let the couple out of his sight. And I'm this lovely little lady's grandfather, along for some family bonding. Though it was a shame her parents couldn't make it, Jiraiya-sama said, and they fell into a more serious discussion about the roles they'd be taking on for the trip. Her hair, as well as Jiraiya-sama's and Kakashi-senpai's, would be dyed a glossy purple-black for the duration, though Jiraiya-sama's would have the gray of a man of his age, and dark-colored contacts would both heighten the family resemblance and, in her case, hopefully mute her tapetum lucidum's tendency to reflect light and hide the narrow vertical slash of her pupils. Jiraiya-sama would be a retired merchant who'd specialized in the distribution of alcohol. His business had been taken over by his son and daughter-in-law, and its robust nature had kept them from joining their children on this trip. Sakura blinked dubiously at this cover. I don't know anything about alcohol, she protested. Ignorance is a woman's virtue, Jiraiya-sama told her facetiously, then grinned when she scowled at him. Not to worry. It wasn't your palate that attracted Itake, it was your skill in accounting, your experience with customer service, and your manners. It'll all be useful when you're the Okamai. Itake's mother owned and managed a ryokan in the south of Hinokuni. Unlike other assignments, they wouldn't have much support for their covers and would have to take care to talk in generalities and avoid giving out information that could be followed up on. As for appearance, Itake himself would have eye-catching silver-white hair, because as Jiraiya-sama had pointed out, he was good-looking enough to be memorable. Rather than attempt to downplay that, it would be easier to simply capitalize on people's imperfect memory and have them remember his hair or the color of his eyes rather than the shape of his face. They dispersed after that to stylists and optometrists and clothing stores. Sakura had to put off buying a civilian-style coat suitable for Iron's climate because she couldn't find one heavy enough. As civilians, they wouldn't be able to use chakra manipulation to help regulate their body temperatures. Otherwise, it didn't take her long to put together a wardrobe. Sakura generally thought of ryokan managers as well-dressed and well-mannered, but also practical, and didn't know why their daughter-in-laws should be any different. She bought sturdy boots and nice clothes, not trendy. Ryokan and their managers were about the furthest thing from trendy that would layer and travel well, and was done with it. Things that she could actually wear afterwards and would wear as well with her natural hair color as her current one. They had a budget, of sorts, but she wouldn't be turning these receipts in at the mission office. I ruined my comfortable field boots during the crush, she said to Itaka conversationally as he fell in beside her, quicksilver hair gleaming like a waterfall down his back. She'd opted for modern clothing for ease of movement, and because she was slightly dubious of kimono in the climate of Iron, whatever his reasons, Itaki had apparently decided that his wardrobe should marry modernity to tasteful wealth. She ignored the part of her brain that insisted that it wasn't going to be any hardship pretending to be married to that. The rest of her could not overlook that for all his manners and his consideration and his cooking, Uchiha Itaka was probably the most dangerous man she'd ever meet. They were at that point in their life where they fit perfectly, but hadn't started breaking down yet. I don't even know if the man who made them survived. I have a second pair, but they're not quite there yet. Destroyed my flak jacket, too, and I'm not eligible for uniform assistance for another 8 months. If there's any money for it, she scoffed. Non-standard body armor is worth the money, but it's still a lot of money. I'm looking forward to seeing your kit. Itaka proved perfectly amenable to the non-controversial topic she'd offered, discussing design and materials and weight considerations. Like this, Sakura could almost pretend that they could be friends. Kill your heroes. Jounin didn't quite have specializations, not like Chunin, but they did have skill sets. Sakura's did not include undercover work much beyond changing her appearance so that a target didn't bolt if their orders were to bring them in alive. She was more of an ambush predator by preference and resistant to the loss of control of her environment and potential complications implicit in civilian dwellings or places of business, but Kakashi-senpai occasionally preferred waiting in a chair to waiting in a tree or on a rooftop. She had no practice and no frame of reference for more elaborate deceptions, ones that followed her home, so to speak. Iron's vernacular architecture reflected their climate, with raised floors to allow for underfloor heating and beds that were essentially very small enclosed rooms to maximize the usefulness of body heat. Elaborately embroidered quilts were the traditional vehicle of feminine expression. Several that qualified as artworks in their own right had been hung in the reception area of the lodge that would serve as their base until Tsunade-sama sent word through the tiny Katsuya that their orders had changed. With the slug to act as a link to her summoner, Jiraiya-sama could set them down practically on top of Tsunade-sama within seconds. Which was all well and good until she stepped into their room with her husband and recognized that not only would she regularly be spending time alone in a room with Itachi, she would be spending time alone with him in a large wooden box. It had been bad enough in the more traditional establishments they'd stayed in during the journey here, where they could lay out their futons with enough space between them that it wasn't much different than with any other teammate. She'd shared space with Tatsuo and she'd both liked and been attracted to him. The difference, she thought, was that she'd been much younger then, so much less sure of herself, and her relationship with Tatsuo was a very different one than what she had with Itachi. Because it was alright to be attracted to Tatsuo, whom she'd liked and trusted, she resented her body's response to Itachi as he played the role of a husband that was unfailingly considerate and quick to sense when companionship would be welcome and when she wanted her own space. She thought darkly that it wasn't his appearance that was the real danger, that was just the lure, like an anglerfish in the darkness of the ocean, but that she would in an unguarded moment slip and think of this as a real relationship rather than something in service to their mission. Ikeda, Itachi murmured with amusement, I'm not quite certain what you're thinking, but I'm certain the bed is innocent. Sakura moved further into the room, conducting a sweep under the guise of putting her things away, Itachi doing the same across the room. The time it had taken them to arrive in Iron, Tsunade-sama was traveling with a large delegation to the border and they therefore had no need to hurry, and Jiraiya-sama apparently did not hurry when he did not have to, had given them plenty of opportunity to establish the public face of their marriage. Unlike the somewhat florid personality he'd assumed for the purpose of writing her letters that needed to be long enough to easily conceal his messages, Itachi had chosen to interpret his role as her husband as one that didn't require a significant shift in his personality, or at least didn't significantly alter the face he'd been showing to her as his true one. He'd surprised her when he'd chosen Ikeda as his most common address of choice when he didn't refer to her by her assumed name without honorifics. She usually only heard that term used by girls her own age, ones like Mariko, to refer to their boyfriends. Or comics to their partners. Not that Itachi was old, but it wasn't exactly common and usually expressed a dissatisfaction with the gender roles reinforced by the kanji that constructed the usual terms for husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend. When introducing her to the receptionist downstairs, it had been Kami-san, which was appropriate within their roles. But when Kakashi-senpai had been needling him about souvenirs, he'd dryly responded that he'd have to ask Okura-daijin, the Minister of Finance. Kakashi-senpai had laughed and asked her if they'd already negotiated his okazukai. Sakura was calling him by his assumed name without honorifics as well and had gratefully taken his lead by not referring to him as Shujin. She'd decided to instead use Taisha for the connotations of the master of an establishment rather than master of her person or auto, which was legalistic, but with less implications of ownership. She wasn't certain that this rather modern take was what Jiraiya-sama had in mind when he'd arranged their roles, but it was effective, and unlike Itachi, who was sort of appallingly endearing on further acquaintance, she was developing rather substantial reservations about the personal habits of the Toad Sage. She'd muttered to Itachi that he was overplaying the lecherous old man stereotype, and he'd grimaced and told her that if it was a role, it was one he had been playing for as long as Itachi had known him. He had at least made efforts to behave once they'd crossed the border, as he was just as famous for his lechery as Tsunade-sama was for her drinking and gambling. So, riding reindeers tomorrow. Better than ice fishing, but what exactly does my grandfather have against museums or art galleries? She asked Itachi as they gathered up their things to brave the weather again for dinner. Sakura asked this, having been in civilian versions of neither of these, though they'd been required to go to the ones maintained by the village in the academy. Her hobbies as a child had involved first Ino's friendship, then her pursuit of Sasuke. As an adult, She'd been busy with missions and training and research, and her hobby turned to reading, which had the advantage of traveling with her. She'd abandoned most of her pretenses when she'd given up on Suzuki. All her cultural lessons like tea ceremony and flower arranging and appreciation of poetry were fading memories that had never proved useful outside table manners, but she hadn't hated them. Sakura wondered what Itaki actually liked to do, when he wasn't being Uchiha Itake's class missing nin. One of the problems with Itake's exquisite manners was that she had to actually pay attention to him to know when he was only being polite, and it was annoying, not least because it was a work in progress. It was also annoying because she was here, thinking about frivolous things like that while her village was trying to pick itself back up and her cage was about to negotiate an alliance that would determine the face of the war they were about to wage. She rationally understood that they wouldn't be in a much better position to come to Tsunade-sama's aid if they were huddled around a fire somewhere in the countryside, thinking grim thoughts and wearing full combat kit, but she still felt the guilt of sleeping in soft beds and taking hot showers. "Your grandfather considers pornography to be literature," Itaki replied. "It also might be that the women who work in museums are usually smarter than his courtship technique allows for." Kakashi-senpai was waiting in the lobby, lurking with his hands in his pockets and a paper mask over his face like he had a cold. Between that and a scarf he'd managed to thus far avoid baring his face. Senpai had proved surprisingly amenable to animals and had suggested that they look into dog sledding, though that was more common in the north in Yuki no Kuni. "Where's grandfather, Oni-chan?" Sakura asked as she pulled on her parka. "We're on our own for dinner tonight. I understand that we can look forward to lots of meat." "Wear your scarf," Itaki scolded her when she would have swept out the door without it. "You'll chap your nose." "Nag," she mouthed at Kakashi-senpai, even as she did as he asked, and then interlaced her fingers with Itaki's. "So I don't have to wear gloves just to cross the street," she told him in reply to his lifted brows. "Kill your heroes." Itaki was settled on the couch, reading, while Sakura was laying belly down on the bed, considering having that argument with Itaki as a way of dealing with the aggression that was the direct result of going from a very intense training regime to Operation Headhunter to civilian levels of activity. When she was regularly subjecting herself to running painful distances with the Ninken or any of the other training exercises, there were long stretches of it she did not enjoy but did anyway, because she did like feeling powerful in her own body and because she preferred the pain she chose to what weakness earned in battle. She hadn't really thought she'd miss it, but here she was, feeling like this room was a cage. After a week and a half, she just wanted to hit something and feel it break, which wasn't an emotion she experienced often. Her mood was not improved by the fact that despite a streak of wearing them successfully, her cosmetic contacts had given her a blinding migraine by noon and she wasn't allowed to use chakra to heal it. She was under the same ban when it came to meditation, which, honestly, she thought an excellent excuse to not discover the full extent of what losing control of the natural chakra had done to her. The seal on her back was strange now, different from the one that Sai had been creating, and it was etched deep and scarred black and bisected by a river of white scales flowing down her spine. Which could be worse? She remembered the dream dragon shape had a mane that went from the crest of her head to the tip of her tail and would be tremendously awkward on her human body. She also had the scales wherever the bones pressed close under the skin at her wrists and ankles as well. She must have made some noise of discontent, because Itaki looked up from his book and his expression gentled. "Is the light bothering you?" He had only the little light on the stand next to the couch on, and Sakura could have dropped the hangings on the bed if that was the source of her irritation. "It's not the migraine. That would go away if I could go to sleep, but who can sleep when we don't do anything? It's really the lack of strenuous physical activity and spending most of the day inside that's getting to me," she admitted. "Does your sunburn still sting?" Itaki's fair skin had proved very susceptible to the sunlight gleaming off the snow. It wasn't to the point of blistering, but had looked very red and painful and slightly comic, as he'd only burned where he had exposed skin, above the line of his scarf and below the shelter of his hood. Almost like he was wearing a red mask. Less now than it did. "I suppose it makes me very convincing as a tourist. Almost as convincing as that very expensive quilt you bought from the gallery. Nothing says tourist like purchasing ethnic art. The natives certainly can't afford it. What are you even going to do with it?" "Display it in our home, of course. Kill your heroes." Itaki had been of two minds about the opportunity this assignment had given him. He would be sharing a bed with the only young woman who had managed to interest him emotionally to the extent that she also interested him sexually, which caused a nervous anticipation such as he hadn't experienced for a very long time. He would also be sharing a bed with the only young woman who interested him across the full scope of human attachment, which was nerve-wracking in ways he hadn't fully imagined could accompany a situation where no one was in danger of dying. Itaki had been accustomed to having control over his body such as few people even dreamed of, and this strange, almost animal response to Sakura had caused embarrassment to become an unwelcome companion of his nights. It was uncomfortable, but it was welcome. Not that he wanted to become like the normal man of Jiraiya-sama's novels. Aside from sounding very much exhausting, he hadn't felt as there was anything wrong with him, as he was who might have pushed for physical intimacy despite the fact that the trust between them had been frayed by that last mission. When he had resigned himself to death and thought that he wanted nothing more than Sasuke's happiness, Itaka was discovering that perhaps he wanted things for himself as well. It seemed he'd only needed that last encounter for selfishness to carve out a little space, telling him that he'd been the perfect shinobi for his family and for his village, so surely he deserved to also be Itaka when it did not interfere with his service to either. And Itaka wanted a chance with Sakura, so for all the awkwardness of arousal, he was a little bit relieved that he would not have to ask that she also compromise any aspect of her own sexuality when he would already have to overcome her antipathy to Sasuke. Sakura was not immune to his campaign of kindness, which he would have carried out regardless of attraction, because Sakura was a kunoichi he respected and hoped to continue working with in the future, which was greatly abetted by their constant proximity. Her body language became more open in private, and she was quicker to laugh, quicker to tease. More honest in her aggression and less on her best company manners. He thought that he could probably build a long and enduring friendship on the foundations he was repairing. The problem was that he lacked both the courage and the knowledge to build romance into the structure without risking sabotage of the whole thing. If they had not had the conversation about his sexuality, he thought with any luck that Sakura might have made the whole thing moot by broaching it herself. Though knowing that she had found him attractive once was not sufficient evidence that she wanted to find him so, or that she would act on it, until Sakura, if it hadn't quite been active repulsion, the sex act had incurred only indifference or disdain for the way others were driven by it. So there was more than a little trepidation on his part about telling her that he wished to recant his claim of asexuality. Given how unnerving he found his attraction to Sakura, he could only be glad that his reaction seemed exclusively limited to her. He told himself to be patient, to enjoy the days of companionship, but the coming war loomed large in the quiet spaces of their conversations. Both of them were field shinobi of considerable talent. That they would be placed anywhere but the front lines was unlikely. The chances that one or both of them would die were quite high, and Itaka knew that he would regret it if he did not say something and take this chance. Just now she was flushed from her bath, her hair spilling forward over her breasts, and he found himself making the offer that had almost escaped him that first night in the hotel, when she'd looked so worn and fierce and wary. "Would you like me to comb your hair?" Sakura glanced over at him, searching his expression. "We've established they haven't bugged the room. The devoted husband can be left outside the door." It took Itaka more courage to hold her gaze in this moment than was required for most battles, because for him it wasn't like he could be snared at a glance, swimming in a colorful ocean of innumerable chances. Attraction was like the sun acting on a seed, sinking its warmth deep and growing slow before he could stretch up and turn his face toward her. "Let me rephrase. I'd like to comb your hair. Will you allow me?" "If you're teasing, you're supposed to let someone know by." Tonal shift, Sakura scolded him, then when his serious expression didn't shift. "Unless you're not teasing." "Why?" Swift, decisive, and coherent, he reminded himself as he replied, "Because it would not take a mission to make me play the devoted boyfriend." Then, because that had been so decisive that he felt heat creeping across his cheeks, he said, "We can negotiate on the marriage once you decide whether or you'll let me touch your hair." Sakura nearly fumbled her comb, then just stared at him for an uncomfortably silent minute. You're not. I thought you weren't, attracted to, anyone." "We learn new things about ourselves all the time," Itaki offered, and couldn't quite help the wryness of his tone. "It also took me by surprise." Surprise, or perhaps anxiety, made the narrow slit of Sakura's jarring new eyes widen until they almost looked human. "This war, the village," she said in a very soft voice, "I just broke up with my last boyfriend because I needed to focus on them. I know what it means to serve our village, Itaki replied, and I also know what it is to fight wars, which is why I am saying something now. I know, Sakura said faintly, I know you do. You would never expect me to prioritize our relationship over my duty to Konohagakure, and I would give you the same respect. But, Uchiha-san, Itaki, what do you expect from this, if I say yes? Are you is it you've never been attracted to someone and want to explore that, or do you expect something serious and long-term? I very much doubt that I could feel attraction without the desire to make something serious of it. Sakura frowned at him in silence for an even longer interval than when she'd first understood what he meant, which was enough to make him even more nervous than he'd already been. Then she confessed, there's a part of me that wants to say that after the village, I want the person I'm with to choose me. Not all the time or exclusively, but when it really counts. Not immediately, of course, because that would be stupid, but someday. But I think that you'll always choose Sasuke. So I want to use him as my excuse, but then I think that I'll probably choose Senpai, except Senpai is a lot less likely to force that kind of choice. And I think that you'll understand that the way most men wouldn't. I'm assuming that you mean to return to the village, but how will people react to that? Whether it's good or bad, you're infamous, and being with you means living my life under scrutiny, at least for the next several years. Maybe for the rest of your life. How will that make me feel? What kind of stress would that put any relationship under? If you're serious, I don't know if you'll want children, and if I manage to have them, I don't know if I want my children to inherit your Kekkai Genkai. I don't even know if I even want children, really. What are you smiling at? She demanded. If this doesn't clearly illustrate that we're both genjutsu types, I'm not certain what would. I'm fairly certain most people don't manage risk assessments quite so thorough when they begin a relationship. Who said we're beginning anything? Sakura asked crabbily. I didn't even make it through my full list. You enumerated many of the reasons why logically you shouldn't, but you never told me no. I could have been building up to it, she grumbled. Were you? No. But that doesn't make any of it less true, she said as she handed over the comb. No, he agreed softly. It doesn't. But Sakura? Thank you. Kill your heroes. The talks collapsed under the weight of the personalities in the room, though they'd managed to drag the death throes out for almost 2 weeks. This village insisted that appeasement would be effective. That village wasn't interested in dealing with the problem so much as they were focused on accusing all the other villages of creating it and sabotaging every attempt at compromise. Tsunade couldn't say she was surprised. She gambled. Compulsively. She was infamous for losing on any odds at all, let alone long ones. And these had been the longest. Suna had been willing to follow her lead, but Gaara's age undermined his authority, and all his good intentions didn't make him any more persuasive as a speaker. She'd bet that within his own village, people listened out of fear if nothing else given his history, but the men and women at this table had been waging war mainly with each other since before his father's time. They had grudges older than he was. When they'd been through dossiers in search of a field commander to recommend for their proposed coalition, she'd begun to think that they didn't have a single experienced Jounin commander who hadn't led a major offensive against one of the villages they were about to recommend them to. They'd settled on Inara that had been a junior commander on several campaigns and prayed that none of the Kage would recognize her name. Now all that effort was wasted, and she could really use a drink before she had to face the alternative to willing cooperation. Nara Kameo protested separating the group while still in iron, but Tsunade had testily pointed out that she had survived without supervision for years before returning to the village. This had not convinced the woman, who unfortunately happened to be friends with Shizune, so Tsunade had grudgingly agreed to relay a message through the Katsuya with Jiraiya, instructing his team to rendezvous with her. She might have fudged the time a little, so that she could have at least one drink without someone looking over her shoulder, but if she was in genuine distress she knew she could trust that particular squad to be on site in less time than it generally took bartenders to pour her a drink. Danzo had made no such protest. She trusted that if she did die in this god-forsaken frozen country he would use it as political leverage. The summit might have failed because when the other Kage looked at her they saw an aging alcoholic with a burned village rather than the leader of the most powerful of the 5 great villages, but he'd make her a martyr upon which to build a war. With her shinobi just waiting for an outlet for their rage and their frustration and Danzo feeding their fury, they'd become a fire that would scorch a Megakure to the ground. Whether or not they survived Akatsuki, she knew that her shinobi would burn themselves up if that was what cost to bring their enemy low. That was what it meant to have a soul of fire. Huddling deeper into her heavy coat, which made her relatively anonymous on the road to a village rumored to make excellent use of potatoes as well as warding off the cold that wanted to seep into her joints despite her chakra circulation, Tsunade contemplated what it meant to return to the wars of her youth without any of the conviction she'd had back then. Old, she thought with a silent groan as she caught a flicker of chakra. It makes me feel old. Did you need something, Uchiha? She called out, resolving to survive the encounter if only to spite Danzo. She was not particularly worried, having overcome her hemophobia she would take a fight before that stiff drink. She had grown up with the Uchiha and Orochimaru at the height of their strength, though not the latter's depravity, and wasn't particularly impressed with Uchiha Sasuke's record. He was certainly no Itachi. She did wonder at the three shinobi clustered behind him as the boy stepped forward into the road. According to all the reports she'd had of Uchiha Sasuke, he wasn't much of a team player. That he found these three useful enough to bring them along said something about their abilities. Answers. His reply was laced with anger, his eyes already gleaming Sharingan red. He glanced back at his team and when he spoke, his tone didn't shift. Find something to do. The red-headed Kunoichi looked as if she might protest, but he snapped, now. I'd say if you want answers, you'll have to ask nicely, but something tells me that's hoping for too much. Just what answers are you looking for? His head swung sharply back toward her, though she was too canny to meet his gaze. He waited until his team had passed beyond hearing range before he spoke, his voice as sharp as a kunao. There was one truth in my life. It was, everything. My brother was a monster who had slaughtered my family and I was going to avenge them all by killing him, no matter what it cost me. Nothing else, not my team, not my village, nothing mattered but that. You'd managed it, from what I'd heard. Tension pulled the muscles in his jaw tight. I did. I killed my brother. And then a man I've never met before in my life shows up and tells me this bullshit story. He says he's Uchiha fucking Madara who should be dead in bones by now and that my family didn't die because Aniki wanted to test the limits of his powers. He tells me it's because his village ordered him to do it. He was almost shouting now, but with a visible act of will he tempered himself. I want you to tell me what happened that night. And I want you to tell me the truth. The truth, huh? Tell me, your brother, this Madara, could you tell if they were lying? What did your Sharingan eyes tell you? I'll know if you are lying and that's all that matters, he snarled. Can you? She asked, considering pointing out that of all people, a Medicnin would have the most control over the processes like pulse rate and pupil dilation he was likely depending on to gauge the truthfulness of her story. Tsunade had never had the patience or the capacity to distance herself emotionally that made truly excellent interrogators. Uchiha Sasuke was all furious energy and frothing at the mouth involved in what he was asking her. She didn't doubt that despite his eyes he'd been all but blind in his encounters with Itachi and the man calling himself Madara. But the truth, well, she could give him that. If I'm going to tell you that story, I'm going to need a drink. Kill your heroes. Chapter 62. Hireth, Part 3. Tsunade thought you could tell a lot about a culture by the spaces they did their drinking in. Iron had a saying that the warmest place in any village was the tavern. Her experiences in them featured roaring fires, entire families crammed into tables scarred by generations, and the best way to prepare just about anything, process it into alcohol. Probably, though Shizune and the god-awful weather had prevented her from conducting an official census of the taverns, had begun their lives as houses and they'd never bothered to rebuild, just tacked rooms or sometimes nearby houses on, the crowd spilling from room to room rather than being housed in a single large, purpose-built space. This one was one of the rambling kind, and because it was early yet, she was able to secure a room and a bottle without much fuss. She set the two glasses down on the table with a thunk and waved at the seat opposite her. Sit, she ordered when he didn't move immediately to seat himself. He obeyed, but stiffly, and his scowl was about as pronounced as the musculature of the human face allowed. She remained standing for a moment as he jerked the chair back and settled into it with the kind of impatient insolence that was universal among teenagers, but only usually so pronounced in merchant-class civilians. He crossed his arms as she filled both glasses generously, liquid threatening to well over the top and only surface tension saving it from spilling onto the table. His body language told her that not only was he not receptive to whatever she had to say, he didn't think her enough of a threat to keep his hands free, or he wanted her to think that he didn't regard her as a threat. As a younger woman, that would have struck the match to her explosive temper, but she was weathered now. More confident and more secure and more apathetic to the opinions of others becoming a son-in had given her the first and the second, while you couldn't be the kind of addict she'd been without the latter. She was steadier and slower in her anger now, if not wiser, though she hoped she was that too. There had to be some advantage to getting old. Besides, for all his posturing, broken veins spider-webbed across his sclera and his eyes were so red-rimmed as to look almost infected. His skin had crossed the point of paleness to that of poor health, made more obvious by the deep purple hollows beneath his eyes. He clearly hadn't slept well since he'd killed Itaki, and enough time had elapsed between then and now that the lack would be preying on both his mind and reflexes. If he wasn't already moody and dogged by paranoia before, he'd be both by now. She slid one of the glasses across the table to him, the liquid sloshing out, wetting the backs of her fingers. "I don't drink," he sneered. Tsunade snorted as she sank into her own chair. "There are some truths that are better washed down with something a little stronger than water. Though I would recommend drinking this a little slower than that if you want to remember this conversation after you've gone through all the trouble of having it," she told him wryly as she took a sip of her own. "Now, you've demanded I tell you the truth. You've apparently decided that I know what the unbiased truth is, despite not having been directly involved in any of it, so we're going to skip the whole 'history is written by the victors' disclaimer, because that's not what you want, is it? You're not looking for the truth so much as an excuse. But that's fine. I can give you the truth as it was given to me, and you can let your brother's actions be their own testimony. Let me make it clear that I'm giving it to you not because of the power of those pretty eyes, but because I don't think that the feelings of a traitor should be taken into consideration, and I don't believe that the story that we've bandied about for years serves our village in this instance. I won't be ashamed of our strength. Keep in mind," she told him after a second sip, after which she returned the glass to the table, "the motivations of your brother and this Madara. Why would your brother lie? Why would Madara tell you the truth?" Sasuke leaned forward sharply, his hands coming forward to grip the edge of the table. "Then it's true," he said roughly. "The village gave the order to murder my family." Tsunade met his gaze evenly, even as the tomo in his eyes began to swirl in agitation. She wasn't a genjutsu type, but for all their power most Uchiha were as subtle with their illusions as bashing someone over the head with a hammer. The real danger was how difficult their genjutsu were to escape, but with her control and sensitivity she could break his hold on her mind and shove a jolt of medical chakra into his spine. Not fatally, but enough to make him less annoying until Itaki arrived and could collect him. If he couldn't move anything below about C7, she could probably actually drink her drink instead of sipping. When someone decides to commit treason and plots the violent overthrow of the current government, that's a capital crime in any shinobi village. Carrying out the order of execution is not murder. That doesn't change when the scale does. When a clan decides that, yes, violence is a perfectly acceptable way to deal with problems they have with Kage and company, they're still criminals. From the point of view of the village, there's no magical, romantic moral superiority in being rebels. Depending on how deeply entrenched this rebellion is in a clan, on occasion, you can only pull them all out by the roots. Again, that's not murder, Uchiha. That's our process of justice. A police action. Your family carried out that same sort of justice for years and years. I wonder how many records you could find of your clan killing someone for turning traitor. More than a handful, I'd wager, especially during wartime and in the early years of the village. They knew what they risked when they committed themselves to their plans. However loyal your brother was, he wouldn't have carried out the order if he thought it was unjustified. He traded his services for your safety. And your ignorance, she said pointedly. For reasons I can't imagine, she continued sardonically, Itaka wanted to keep knowledge of your family's crimes from you. From everyone, so you could grow up the last son of a powerful clan who'd fallen on the sword of one med shinobi, instead of their own ambition. The assets and the estate were left untouched, so that even if you had to live without your family, you wanted materially for nothing. And without your clan there to remind them of it, people forgot why they resented and feared the Uchiha. You grew up like a little orphaned prince and then threw all of that away. I wonder what your brother thought, when he heard. You don't get to talk about my brother, Sasuke snarled, but there was something empty and desperate in his conviction. His knuckles were white with strain against the table and there was a flush of anger in his cheeks. Uchiha Sasuke, despite all evidence, was not stupid, he was instead intent on lashing out so that he didn't have to feel anything else or actually move past the trauma of his past. Tsunade knew exactly what that felt like, only she'd by that point developed a phobia of blood and had to channel all that aggression into self-destruction instead. Oh? I can't. It seems to me that you're the one who betrayed him. Maybe you're the one who doesn't have the right to talk about Uchiha Itachi. They hesitated on a precipice and for one moment, Tsunade thought that it had been one jibe too many, but then Sasuke sighed through clenched teeth and slumped back into his seat. He made a mistake, he said as he slowly reached for his glass. Your brother. The man who called himself Madara. He found my team almost immediately after, his throat worked as he swallowed, after. He knew who I'd been fighting. He knew why we fought. Which meant that, despite knowing the truth, despite knowing that my brother was just a knife in some Hokage's hand, he stood there and watched and let me kill my brother. I don't know if I believe you when you say that my family were traitors or that they deserved to be massacred for it, but I know that I won't be used as a pawn in some stranger's game. Not after that. And what are you going to do instead? Tsunade asked him. Hunt this Madara like you hunted Itachi-san? I imagine one or more of your team is a tracker, because you don't seem the type to bother otherwise. Sasuke finally took a sip of his drink and grimaced, which was almost enough to set Tsunade to laughing. Vodka was possibly the least offensive drink with any real alcohol content in existence. This was not good vodka, but it didn't bite or burn or glow nearly neon in dim light. She probably should have chosen something else, something serious and grim that would gleam golden amber in the firelight. Something meant for drinking, instead of just getting drunk, but she'd spent years content that wet and cheap for sufficient recommendations for alcohol. You're hunting Akatsuki, he said, shoving the glass away from him. We've hunted Akatsuki, she corrected. Now we're going to war with the village behind them. From the sound of things, your Madara will likely be a part in that war. And I'm not going to order my shinobi to stand down so that you can hunt him for yourself, if that's what you're getting at. And if I cooperated with you? Tsunade blinked at the unexpected offer. You mean, hunt him in cooperation with the Konohagakure team? Uchiha, if the man claiming to be Madara is even half as dangerous as the real thing, it's still an S-class mission. It's not like providing security for some rich man's birthday party, where trust between team members is useful but not critical. I can't trust you, because you've made it very clear you'll prioritize your own agenda over any order I give. What makes you think that I'd risk shinobi like Hatake Kakashi or Haruno Sakura by asking them to trust you? It was his turn to be surprised. Sakura? He asked blankly. You're like the dictionary definition of tunnel vision, Tsunade told him when she decided that his surprise wasn't feigned. Witch and Hound are about as close as we get to Hunter Nin and Konohagakure. If there was going to be a dedicated hunt for an S-class target, they'd be part of it, she told him. Your last encounter with them was, what, over a year ago now? I don't remember the details, but I do recall that hope for reconciliation didn't play a huge part of in anyone's report except for Naruto's. Neither of them are the sort to refuse an order, though passive-aggressive Kakashi would probably be enough to make her regret it if she did, but why would I give it? Whether or not he's Madara, he is an Uchiha, Sasuke retorted. And I am your best chance to strike him down. Tsunade raised her brows skeptically. True or not, why would you want to work with us at all? You left Konohagakure when it suited you, and while your team is from Otagakure, killing its cage is a pretty good indication that you don't have much use for a village. I'm certainly not going to spend even an iota of effort to stop you from throwing yourself at an enemy of my village. If you succeed, I might even send you a thank you card. The muscles worked in his jaw and Tsunade wondered if he'd thought she'd fall down in gratitude for the opportunity to help him carry out his newest mission of vengeance. Not that she wouldn't use him. Passive-aggressive Hatake was preferable to disappointed Elder Uchiha, but there was a way to it. Uchiha Sasuke had gotten accustomed to thinking of himself as the one negotiating from the position of power, but this wasn't the case here. He'd have to learn to humble himself and ask nicely. Some part of her was distinctly amused that apprenticing under someone as insidious as Orochimaru, who was silver-tongued when it suited him, had left him still so bereft of basic social skills. Maybe it was for the best he hadn't stayed under Hatake's command. He might have been reduced to just growling at people by this point. "I want to come back," Sasuke said between clenched teeth, "because my tracker can't trace Madara. But he'll come for you." Tsunade found it telling that he'd already made the attempt, but the fact that he'd wanted a conversation instead of a confrontation was proof enough on its own that he'd distrusted what their mystery shinobi had to say. Why not just keep working for Akatsuki? You've already caused enough trouble on their behalf by capturing the Eight Tails. He'd contact you again. Except I didn't capture Kyumigakure's Jinchuriki. He'd told me that Aniki acted on the village's orders to carry out the massacre. My brother wouldn't suddenly decide to actually defect after that. Akatsuki was just another mission, wasn't it? The Kyuubi was his assignment. I know better than anyone that he could have taken Naruto at any time. He didn't, so I didn't take the Hexabi. Whatever they're doing with the tailed beasts isn't something they bothered to explain, and I was more interested in gaining just enough of their trust to leave without them looking over my shoulder. My skill set isn't meant for capture missions, and they ought to know that. I wasn't afraid of being blamed, but I didn't realize the Jinchuriki himself would be useful. He was alive and outside Akatsuki's control when I left him. That's not the story that the Raikage is telling. Sasuke shrugged. Like I said, he was alive when I left him and in no danger of that changing. What he did after that isn't my problem. I'm not interested in helping Akatsuki's cause, even if I was interested in playing long games. So, say we're useful to you. And after? After? He asked, like he hadn't even considered that there would be an after. Yes, after. What, you thought that you'd kill him and the world would just slam to a stop? Didn't work so well with your last vengeance, did it? There was a long, pregnant silence, and then Sasuke said, "The third is dead. The other people who were involved in the decision to execute my family, are they still alive?" Madara gave me a name. Danzo. Is he still alive? He said that he'd be attending the summit. As of about an hour and a half ago, yes, he was alive. Several of the others that would have been involved in the investigation and in the final decision are still hobbling along, but they were elders even then. They're wily old foxes, to be sure, and Danzo's certainly got plenty of bite left, but given another decade or less and time will do your work for you. Not much glory there. And, given warning, not nearly as easy as you found hunting your brother. They're old men and women, but the shinobi of Konohagakure will stand between you and them. In other words, Uchiha, however annoying I find them personally, I'm not going to hand them over to you so you can keep on marching blithely down your path of vengeance. Sasuke considered this, then sank slowly back into his seat. We hunt Madara successfully and you allow me access to the records. If I'm satisfied that my family actually planned to revolt, I'll end it. I'll surrender myself to your justice. Tsunade scoffed. If you're satisfied? I'll allow you access to something even better than records. I'll let you talk to one of the primary sources. And then, satisfied or not, you're going to stand down and surrender yourself to my justice. Capic. A very long, tense silence, and then understood. Good. I'll even give you an advance on my end of the bargain. It's about time you told your little brother the truth, isn't it, Uchiha Itachi? Kill your heroes. Sakura's most pressing worry 12 minutes ago was that it had been a mistake to say yes to Itachi since the words had slipped from her lips. There was an uncertainty riding her bones that she hadn't felt in years and years, though it wasn't uncertainty about Itachi's feelings. Committed to Itachi was also openly affectionate Itachi, but the idea of having him had been too powerful and hurting him unpalatable, and now it was whether her nerve would fail her at using Hiraishin and natural chakra again. She wouldn't let it, but she'd never felt pain like that before either. Like her chakra channels had become pathways of fire and stepping out of the flame meant death or failure. She hadn't had the courage to fully test what the natural chakra had done to her interior landscape and what might happen if she used it again. Where once she'd meditated daily, She'd fed herself excuses about time and lack of opportunity and now could only swallow down the bitterness of being unprepared. Sakura would walk through fire to step between her Hokage and Sasuke. She would. That did not mean that she did not fear being burned. She and Senpai stood sentinel on either side of the doorway, Jiraiya-sama leaning casually against the frame, as Itaka stood silently in front of a dumbstruck Sasuke who, after only moments, turned on her with the most vicious expression she'd ever seen on his face, including after she'd made him kill his mother. "You," he snarled, "this is you doing this." Sakura's hands hadn't left the hilts of her knives from the moment she'd sensed Sasuke's chakra and unsealed them, so it was less than a thought for their weight to settle comfortably in her palms, and she shifted her weight, ready to go between. Her blades were clean of poison and she regretted that, but they were sharp enough to cut through bone. "Please," Itaka murmured without glancing over at her. Sakura didn't respond or spare him any attention, focused instead on the enemy in front of her. She did not trust Sasuke and she did not trust Itaka's judgment when it came to his little brother. Sasuke was a dangerous enemy with the advantage of the Sharingan. His skill with ninjutsu wasn't something someone like Sakura could scoff at, though she had confidence that her foot and blade work was better than Sasuke's. The real contest would be speed. They would both strike to kill, though the chances that Itaka would interfere were quite high. Leaving aside that Sakura would show you an illusion of myself in disguise, little brother, mother called you her little duckling from the time you could toddle until after your 3rd year at the academy, when you decided you were too old for nicknames. That didn't stop you from following her around the house, however. You really were adorable as a child. He still has a certain charm, Kakashi-senpai added lackadaisically. Some people like sour things. Sasuke's scowl didn't soften, but his hands dropped away from his Chokyuto. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "This isn't the illusion," Sakura replied scathingly. "Your battle with Uchiha-san was. I'd have known if it was a genjutsu," Sasuke snapped. "Would you have? You can't even tell that the real person is standing right in front of you now," Sakura said. "That was a very unusual technique," Itaka interjected, "that involved the use of a flesh and blood vessel and made full use of both your genjutsu and your medical knowledge. If it was known of and ranked, I have no doubts that it would have been considered S-class. You weren't meant to see through it, little brother." Sakura's fingers tightened on her knives, hair prickling along her forearms and stomach twisting uncomfortably at that particular technique being spoken of in public. "My apologies. I know it is rude to ask everyone to step outside, but may I ask for some time alone with my brother?" Itaka asked. "Go for it," Tsunade-sama said, collecting her glass and bottle of alcohol from the table. "Now that my stalwart protectors are here, I can sit down and have a real drink." Sakura obediently followed Tsunade-sama from the room, concealing her knives within the conveniently long fall of her coat. They hadn't had time or cause to fully shed their civilian guises, especially as they hadn't yet crossed the border. "If you're hungry, go to the bar and get something to eat," Tsunade-sama told both of them as she sitting at a table near one of the windows. Family melodrama always takes a while even when they aren't bodies involved. She and Senpai exchanged a speaking glance and Senpai shrugged, divesting himself of his coat and settling himself comfortably in a chair at the end of the table. A somewhat ragged novel was produced in short order and he seemed intent on ignoring the drinking party forming at the table as Jiraiya-sama returned from investigating the food offerings. Sakura hesitated briefly before sloughing her own coat, pretending unease she was far from feeling. At least initially. After a restroom break that was following by a cup of steaming hot chocolate swimming with marshmallows, Sakura was considering following the example of her fellow patrons and indulging in the heavy, fantastic-smelling food that the servers kept sweeping by with. As she was contemplating some sort of meat pie on the next table over, Senpai nudged her with his knee. "Buy me dinner," he told her without looking up from his book. "Why should I?" Sakura retorted. "Because you love me?" Sakura narrowed her eyes at him. "If we were dating, Senpai, I'd put a collar on you and tell you that you were a bad dog and teach you some manners." There was a strangled sound from Jiraiya-sama's direction and Sakura flushed as she realized that, despite all appearances, Tsunade-sama and Jiraiya-sama hadn't been as entangled in their own conversation as she'd thought. Her blush only deepened when Kakashi-senpai blandly replied, "What, you're going to tell me to stay off the bed?" This collar ought to be lined with something. Leather makes me sweat. Wait, Jiraiya-sama said, one hand outstretched as if he could really hold back this conversation. I thought you and the prettier Uchiha had an understanding. Itachi-san. Good job securing that one, Harano, Tsunade-sama said, lifting her glass in a toast. Who gets rid of the dog just because they've brought in a spouse? Kakashi-senpai replied in response to Jiraiya-sama's comment. I don't mind. I've already lived with that rampaging cat for so long, adding one more person to the household won't make any difference. At least I won't ever have to worry about waking up to find Itachi-san staring at me like he's composing a list of ways to kill me while he lurks atop your closet. Sakura considered letting her head fall against the table with a solid thunk, but retreated with slightly more dignity, waving over a server and ordering food for both herself and senpai. Judging by the gleam in both Tsunade-sama and Jiraiya-sama's eyes, though, they weren't about to let her off so easily. By the time that Itachi and an extremely subdued Sasuke appeared from the room next door, Sakura was grateful that after the first round of teasing, the talk had turned back to a much quieter and more subdued discussion of how Konohagakure could feasibly launch a war with their village destroyed. So, that's it then? Tsunade-sama asked. Are you satisfied now, Uchiha-san? Sasuke nodded, an abbreviated and abrupt gesture, and Sakura could not help but note that his eyes were even more red-rimmed than when they'd left the brothers. Itachi's were as well, more faintly, and that curbed a little of the vicious stab of satisfaction she felt when looking at the clearly miserable Sasuke. Good. Now we can go home. Perhaps if you really distinguish yourself in this coming war, you'll enjoy the benefits of selective memory and get to stay there without much fuss. Women have a soft spot for prodigal sons. Though she offered to wait for the brothers to eat if they were hungry, both declined, so the party settled their bill and bundled back up for the cold. Sasuke's team had been lurking nearby and were retrieved shortly, and then this motley company turned their feet back toward Konohagakure. Tsunade-sama had ordered that since it was Sasuke's team dressed as ninja, it was they who could keep formation. Wealthy merchant families hiring armed guards when traveling wasn't unusual enough to be remarked upon. The others were left to travel as they pleased, so Sakura was by senpai's side, discreetly analyzing Sasuke's team. She told herself that it was purely an exercise in awareness of a potential hostile force, but the restless part of her could not help but wonder what it was these people had that Team 7 had lacked. It was a mostly silent and uncomfortable journey until after they crossed the border, where Sakura was glad to shed her disguise and be able to wear her knives and kit openly. Well, aren't you just pretty as a flower? Sasuke's shark-toothed swordsman Suijutsu said as she came down the stairs of the inn. Sakura, who was tucking the last unruly strands of hair up into a careless bun, fixed unamused dragon green eyes on him, which caused his grin to falter momentarily. Okay, another instance of crazy eyes from Konohagakure. Still pretty, though. If you're flirting with intent, I'm seeing someone, Sakura replied, ignoring the way that Sasuke had glanced over at the comment about her eyes. Too bad, Suijutsu said. I'm quite the catch. This caused the red-headed Kunoichi to snort and roll her eyes. Really, Suijutsu? Just because people won't give you the time of day doesn't mean you need to be a bitch, Karen, he sneered at his teammate. Pretty girls get options. In Sakura's opinion, Karen was quite pretty, but her temper was vicious when it came to her white-haired teammate, and she was almost cringingly fawning when she spoke to Sasuke. There was an uncomfortable echo of old Sakura there, but Sakura ignored the discomfort. She thought she'd probably find the other Kunoichi quite tolerable, but even though they'd been sharing rooms since the teams had begun traveling together, her marriage ruse with Itachi had fallen by the wayside. Karen hardly spoke to her. You were clingy when we were teammates and now you're vicious. Who'd be stupid enough to date you? Sasuke asked, ignoring the way his teammates were about to engage in round 347 of the argument that seemed to never end. I have no complaints about Sakura's personality, was Itachi's even reply, which brought the war between Suijutsu and Karen to a dead silence. Say what? Sasuke ground out eventually. Your brother is the person stupid enough to date me, Sakura sighed. Of course, he's also the person stupid enough to want to save you, so I suppose we should both be grateful for his terrible judgment. Sasuke's eyes flicked between Sakura and Itachi, as if he was waiting for one of them to announce that it was a joke, and his expression blackened as no such announcement was forthcoming. "You can't be serious," he said to Itachi, whose brow rose as the accusation. "You've told me of your grievances, but what occurred between you was on the battlefield. Let it go." Sasuke's expression was the definition of unwilling, and he glared at Sakura like it was somehow her fault that his brother wasn't unilaterally siding with him. To be fair, Sakura thought grudgingly despite herself, that it had been a very ugly sort of trick. "I was trying to prove to Itachi that you weren't worth it," she said abruptly. "All of this," she made a vague motion with her hand, "most of it done for your sake. And I didn't think you deserved it. So I decided to show him your ugliest self. Maybe I'll regret it, maybe I won't. We weren't friends, so I won't say, let's be friends again, for your brother's sake. But we were allies. We can be that again. You've seen my genjutsu and I've watched your ninjutsu. You've met my knives and I've been introduced to your sword. We can be useful to each other." Sasuke's dark eyes were suspicious and narrow as he met her gaze. "What happened to your eyes?" he asked instead of giving an answer. "They weren't like this last time." "Combat incident," Sakura replied, then her lips quirked. "Chakra-induced cell mutation. Who knows, maybe something like this is the way your Kekkai Genkai originated." Sasuke grunted, then slowly nodded his head. "Fine. Allies." Kakashi-senpai chose this moment to say, "So, is this what heartwarming family moments are going to look like once you're in-laws? Kill your heroes." The time it had taken for the alliance to fall through had not been sufficient for them to return to a repaired Konohagakure. The bodies that had resisted resurrection or died twice within an hour had been cremated as soon as could be managed, and they'd cleared the roads and stabilized the areas which had collapsed into the cave systems below the city. Priority was given to restoring infrastructure and government buildings, leaving private ones for the moment to individual enterprise. In short, the city still looked as if someone had plowed roads through some massive landfill. "What is this?" Sasuke asked, staring at the wreckage that little resembled the proud village he'd left. "This is just the first strike in a long war," came Tsunade-sama's reply. "Take a good look around as we cross into the city, Uchiha. This is what happens when you let violence visit you in your own city. This is what your clan died to prevent. Kill your heroes." Chapter 62. Hojirisksa. Kakashi-senpai and she parted ways with the others upon arrival in the village, as Itachi would be debriefed and Sasuke and his team interrogated, and Tsunade-sama had a war to plan. The housing situation had changed, if not improved, and for the first time in her life Sakura found herself in barracks-style accommodations. Konohagakure's shinobi were not an army in the usual sense. They were military contractors, offering specialized services like surveillance, protection, or any number of other things that their employers did not have the personnel or training to provide for themselves. They were usually in the field or hosted on-site. When a mission ended, they returned to their own private homes. Now she and the other single jounin without clan exemptions shared rooms with their partners in designated apartments, another housed those with families. Chunin and Genin were racked in with their squads in other buildings, which delighted absolutely no one, especially those jounin sensei in charge of underage teams. Making certain they did things like laundry and didn't live like animals was somewhat outside their normal responsibility when at home. Sakura did not mind living with Kakashi-senpai, which she'd never quite had the courage to bring up on her own, though they'd been all but doing it before. Sometimes she thought about how Itachi might feel if everyone survived the coming conflict and she and Tsude and all the Ninken and Kakashi-senpai kept living in a bustling, warm space like this, where almost immediately there were pet hairs on every surface. Bed was a place where the Ninken let you sleep if they were feeling generous, and midnight trips to the bathroom were treacherous obstacle courses. Of course, if he intended to bring Sasuke under the same roof, his opinion on Kakashi-senpai's presence would be considered null and void. This was only if she and he were still a they by the time the war had finished. It was easier to think about her own small matters than what would happen if the village was unable to meet their obligations to their clients and began defaulting on contracts. The fact that it wasn't simply resource conservation but also suicide prevention that meant no one lived alone, and what sort of black tactics might be used to level the playing field in a war against Akatsuki. More immediately, what concerned her now was a strange, almost thready sensation in her chakra, like she was tied to something and it was tugging at her. She'd only noticed it as they drew close to the village, which made it more curious. It would have been alarming wherever she'd noticed it. Slipping from her futon, Sakura sought the one thing in short supply with so many in a small apartment: privacy. She dashed off a quick note for Kakashi-senpai before she slipped out the window, knowing that he would respect her escape but not a disappearance, and into the still too quiet, still too dark night. The training fields had escaped the worst of the crush, and so it was atop the red bridge that had once served as Team 7's meeting point that Sakura settled into a meditation posture and tried to reach for the right state of mind to explore her inner landscape. It was easy to control her breathing, that was almost muscle memory by this point, but it was much harder to find the kind of peace she needed. There was too much fear in her, and she'd trained herself to react to fear by confronting it with violence. Maybe there were some shinobi that could sink into themselves in the action of the moment, but Sakura needed stillness. Quiet. Usually if she couldn't find them on her own, she listened to the reliable and comforting sound of Kakashi-senpai breathing, but now she listened to the water flowing by until her awareness sank quietly into her own familiar flows. Except that they weren't so familiar any longer. Like after a 100-year flood, her interior landscape was no longer as she remembered it. The pool of chakra at her core was deeper and stranger than she'd ever seen it, her tendon housing what looked like a slowly rotating something at her core that almost seemed to glow. She was sharply reminded of the luminous pearls that were always clutched in the talons of dragons in paintings and statues. When her consciousness brushed against it, she discovered that it wasn't a pearl, it was a tightly wound skein of natural chakra that threatened to rouse at her attention. Pulling back from it like she'd been burned, she traveled along the ebbs and flows until she came to where something foreign tangled with her own chakra. Exploring this aberration even more cautiously than she normally would, after the strangeness in her tendon, her eyes fluttered open when she recognized the chakra. Sigh. Her hand fluttered instinctively toward the seal they'd both thought a failure. The ink had once been invisible beneath her skin, much like the seal they'd been applying on her back, but after she'd been pulled back from the Reikai, both had slowly re-emerged. She'd thought it was some sort of strangely colored bruising at first, but then the glossy, red-sheened black had defined itself into a tangle of complex lines and characters. While still in talismanic script, the handwriting wasn't size any longer. Neither was the pattern of the seal. She was still panicking, very quietly, about that. Like an insect caught in a web might feeling the spider plucking at the strands, Sai must have felt her exploration of their chakra bond. Now that she was aware where the trail led, she could sense him vaguely, something that refined itself as he approached. She didn't think you were supposed to be able to feel other people like she could feel Sai as he drew closer, not without your hands on them, alight with medical chakra. She could feel the beat of his heart and the slow work of his lungs, and where the mixture of ink and chakra ran down from his knee to make his prosthetic work with all the dexterity of his remaining limb. She could see the prosthetic as well, for while he had his kit, he hadn't bothered with proper pants, just his sleep shorts. He'd taken artistic liberties and now had clawed toes like some sort of diva. He blinked at her, deceptively sleepy-eyed, hair tousled. I feel like saying, "I can feel you moving inside me," isn't the first thing you ought to say when you haven't seen someone for weeks and who managed to die in the meantime, but it's so distracting I think it's worth mentioning. Sakura choked on helpless laughter. That's terrible, Sai. He tilted his head slyly to one side. How about, I felt you coming. Sakura only shook her head and thought about shoving him playfully, and then thought better of it. She wasn't certain how well recovered his balance was, and wouldn't that be a terrible way to say hello after not seeing him for weeks? Well, now that we've addressed the incredible strangeness of this, she waggled her hand between them, with bad sex jokes, now might be a good time to discover if the seal is functional or well, it obviously has a function, but I don't know. It doesn't. Well, you can probably guess that's something changed, because it didn't work before, but it wasn't something a change I made to the seal. It mutated, somehow. Both of them. Strange. Almost as strange as mysterious mass resurrections, Sai said dryly. And probably not at all connected. I want to see that thing I've been painting on your back first. Anything that went wrong or right, I guess probably started there. She saw, or rather felt, his first hesitation in the use of the prosthetic after they'd moved somewhere less exposed than the bridge. When Sai knelt behind her, what should have been an easy, Almost thoughtless, movement had become something he had to think about. But it had only been weeks. A civilian in the same set of circumstances might still be learning to walk over uneven ground, though she didn't have much frame of reference for the recovery rate of civilians who didn't have the money to pay for medicnin. Sakura might not have needed light any longer, but Sai did. Sakura squinted at even the weak beam of his flashlight, but willingly sat still for his inspection, her knees drawn up to her chest and pinning the fabric of her top against her breasts. "Does it work?" he asked after long, silent minutes. "Well, probably," she replied. "Probably. I haven't made the attempt to channel natural chakra since the crush. And why not?" Though it wasn't that cold out, even without a shirt, as compared to the country she'd just left, Sakura shivered. "It hurt. A lot," she said flatly. "Channeling it through the incomplete seal. It always hurt when you integrated a new section of the seal or tested it," Sai pointed out. "And you were always willing to do it then." Sakura clenched her teeth tight, because she knew that to say that she hadn't died because of it back then meant that Kakashi-senpai should never push himself beyond his limits for the sake of others or any of the shinobi of Konohagaku or stand against an opponent that outmatched them. She stared at the bony protrusion of her wrist bone and the scales there that scattered light in a different way than the paleness of her skin. "Have you ever wondered," she asked softly, "if we came from the spirit world and go back to it, what you were there? Who your friends were and how you lived? How long you stayed before reincarnating?" Given how quickly he answered, she didn't think that Sai even had to mull over his reply. "I've always had enough problems in the here and now without needing to consider things that happened in a lifetime I have no memory of." Root promoted self-examination, but not self-reflection. Sakura hummed thoughtfully, then hissed a sigh through her teeth. "How likely do you think it is that it'll do something bizarre to you if I try this while the other seal is active? Danzo-sama likes you. He'll forgive you if you accidentally kill me, but expect him to use it as leverage." Sakura twisted around to stare at Sai, who offered her a beatific smile. "Sometimes you really make me want to punch you. That's because you're a violent hag, which is not my fault." Sakura was braced for fire licking at her insides again, so she almost didn't notice at first the sensation like sinking into warm bath water. It wasn't at all like before. That had been power like riding lightning, trading immense power for overwhelming pain. This was just the power. Not without price, though, or risk. Sakura might not have conventional medicnin training, but it didn't require more than observation skills to watch the scales slowly creep up her arms, emerge on her collarbones like freckles in the sun, the strange but not uncomfortable pressure of antlers beginning to emerge. "I thought that the seal was supposed to prevent side effects," Sai said as he curiously prodded one of the antler nubs. Sakura swatted his hand away. "Clearly not," she ground out, spooling the natural chakra back into its tsunami-like rotation in her core. It drew in the remaining foreign chakra in her body and the physical changes receded, which loosed some of the tension that had settled into her bones. "Well, it doesn't kill you and there's no sign of it turning you to stone. Or a toad. So I suppose we can pronounce it functional, Dragon King." It had been Sai, far better at reading talismanic script, who had puzzled out what the king seal now said. Originally a larger seal formed around a triadic core using king, ox, and horse characters presumably referring to King Yama, ox head, and horse face. Knowing the somewhat grim humor of Umbu Team 9, they'd failed to adapt it so that it worked with only 2 people. Now it seemed to work all too well between her Dragon King and his Komenu seal. Since she'd plucked the string that tied them, she hadn't lost her unnatural awareness of him. While they'd been tracking the slow creep of her transformation, they'd discovered that Sakura could lend her own chakra, not natural chakra, though probably that as well, but they were attempting some measure of responsible experimentation even if they were doing it crouched in the wooded dark with Sakura half-dressed and manipulate size chakra, as well as receive it. In short, except for the awareness, which had never been mentioned in Araki-san's journal, and given that it had been Gozen-san who'd been king of that array, he might never have known of it, it functioned as intended. Sakura didn't trust it. Good things did not spontaneously happen in her shinobi life. Good things were ground out with painstaking research and sweat and blood and usually fear. She and Sai had made their attempt at the seal and set the project aside until they found someone else to bring in to stabilize it, and giving someone access to your chakra through an array recovered from the journal of a mentally unstable Umbu member was not a selling point, and though she was no expert at resurrection, it shouldn't have caused either seal to complete itself. Sai hadn't even died and his seal had been affected. Sakura was caught off guard by a yawn, though she shouldn't have been. They'd been at this for hours, the sky beginning to gray with the promise of dawn. See you in daylight, Sai offered, looking rather worn himself. Daylight, Sakura agreed. Kill your heroes. Sometime a little after dawn, Sakura received a summons that had her following an Umbu down into the rebuilt levels beneath the Hokage Tower. She had never really been in the rooms and corridors below the public levels of the tower. Aside from the now devastated document storage, it was also where the Hokage or someone from the mission office handled S-class briefings or anything assigned to an Umbu team. There had been other things here once, resources for Jounin-rank shinobi, but what remained of them was a restoration project being handled by the village elders. Witch and Hound had been mission office favorites for how quickly they cleared their assignments, which was at least in part because they didn't return to the village between them, so she had the field experience but not much confidence in navigating the areas her rank had opened up to her. Though Sakura was fairly certain rank alone wouldn't have been sufficient to get her through the door the Umbu took her to, she couldn't help but feel a sharp stab of anxiety when she was left alone in a room that contained both Shimura Danzo and Tsunade-sama. The blade twisted when she realized she was alone in the room with them. Tsunade-sama, in the few instances she'd met her in person, had never bothered to use body language to intimidate. Today she was slouched deep into her chair, eyes lidded as she supported her head on one fisted hand. Danzo-sama, by contrast, had his back to her as she entered, one hand clasped around the opposite wrist. Without the bandages, which had at least offered the comfortable illusion of physical weakness, she found him deeply unsettling. She was confident he had the welfare of the village first and foremost in his mind. She just didn't trust that the Konohagakure she loved and killed for would still be herself if she employed his ways and means. She did not particularly like what his presence implied for her personally, either. Hara no Sakura, Tsunade-sama said without raising her head from where it rested on her hand. Sakura was not annoyed by this, because even with the benefit of genjutsu the older woman looked exhausted. Sometimes it was difficult to recall her true age, between the illusion of youth and her inexhaustible energy. Today was not one of those days. Today Tsunade-sama looked old. Danzo, though a generation her senior, just looked hard. Ready. Like war was something he fed on and was energized by. Yes, ma'am, was Sakura's automatic reply. The Witch of the Woods. Ma'am. I've read your files. Talked to my legacy Umbu. While you're not an heir to her technique in the traditional sense, and I can't imagine what a mentorship with Grandmother Nightmare must have been like, I understand that you're the closest thing we've got. Umbu Team 9 was infamous for their ability to control a battlefield with fear. Could you do the same, not just to a battlefield, but to a village? A village? Sakura repeated weakly. A Megakure, Danzo confirmed. We've had reports that the skies above it have been clear since the crush, but the first clouds were sighted yesterday. We don't have conclusive proof that it's linked to the recovery of a Megakure's leader who was responsible for the crush and presumably the resurrection, but according to Uchiha Itachi a large part of this pain's god status is linked to his ability to sense what occurs within his village. Jiraiya suspects he could be a particularly adept sage with a water elemental affiliation and has been using that to amplify his abilities. He turned back to the large map posted on the wall, before he continued. The rain is clearly important. A Megakure and the country it is located in, obviously has always had warm, wet summers and brief dry winters, but its current weather is clearly unnatural. It's turned the whole area into a swamp, whereas before it was rivers and plains. Destabilized house foundations and destroyed the local ecology. Nothing grows there any longer, and if it weren't for the irrigation channels that take the runoff into the surrounding area, it would be a swamp in the middle of a desert wasteland. That didn't inspire civilian resentment? Or the daimyos? I wouldn't think he'd allow anything that would risk the harvest or destabilize the economy. Hanzo the Salamander ended his life as a paranoid despot, but he was first a genius, Tsunade-sama said flatly. Strangely enough, the former didn't entirely negate the latter. We Sunin earned our fame by surviving him. The people of Omegakure survived him for years. The daimyo didn't. I'm certain they were at first very grateful for their liberation. We don't have an exact date for Hanzo's death, but it's plausible to assume that there was likely a chaotic transition period. Various factions, free of Hanzo, were probably scrabbling for power at the expense of a population who didn't have the power to fight back, even if the will hadn't been stomped out of them. Enter Pain, God, and Savior. As far as we can tell, Danzo said, taking over the narrative, it was Pain himself that created the current irrigation system, so it wasn't quite as if they directly exchanged one dictator for another. We're actually not certain why he felt the need to monitor his own village so closely, at least once he'd established himself, but his little surveillance storm provides a useful indicator for us. If we can take him while he's weak, good, and if it's a trap, well, there's nothing going to change soon for us that would put us in a stronger position. Naruto has finished his sage training and come out of seclusion. He will be under Jiraiya's command, on a team assigned to deal with Pain and any other S-class threats. The Kazekage and several other select shinobi will be joining them. Sakura thought she probably looked a little hunted by this point, her mouth dry and the muscles across her back tight. And if I could do it, if I could bring terror to an entire village, she said, stumbling over the words as her breath hitched, what would my place in this be? You'd strike the first blow and burst them open like a rotten melon as the officer in charge of Operation Cloudburst, Tsunade-sama said. I know that Team 9 worked in concert. I understand that it might be difficult to find people with whom you can cooperate well enough to perform a complex genjutsu with, especially when I tell you that you can't have either of the Uchiha and all of the clan heirs are off limits. None of the heirs will be allowed to enter Omegakure and the Uchiha will be making themselves useful elsewhere. Hatake will be working with you, of course. You'll also have Cho-sama and the most skilled members of the puppet corps under your command. You'll be assisting them in infiltrating the village, before you cast your genjutsu. Rising from her slumped position, Tsunade opened a folder that had been pinned beneath her elbow. Sit, she commanded, which Sakura did, even as she understood that seeing anything in that folder was probably as good as agreeing to complete the task. Tsunade slid a large, folded piece of paper over to her and Sakura unfolded it several times over to discover a hand-drawn map of what she assumed was the city Omegakure. The one on the wall was of the surrounding country. You and your team will retrieve vessels from these areas, she said, pointing out sections that had been flagged on the map. I don't need to tell you to choose those who won't be missed. Cho-sama has forbidden passing on the technique for corpse puppets, but she has agreed to make them herself for the corps members who will be entering Omegakure in native flesh, so to speak. They're there to give teeth to your terror. Puppet masters can do a lot of damage in very little time when they don't have to worry about friendly fire. Once the fear starts, they'll do their work in the resulting chaos. What your team does after that depends on whether you have to remain static to keep the jutsu in place or if you can anchor it. Sakura's hands curled around the edges of her map. She thought about how embarrassing it might be to hyperventilate on the table in front of Tsunade-sama and Danzo. She was not quite certain she cared, the way her insides were trembling. She told herself that she would have Kakashi-senpai, whether it was her in charge of the mission or not. I'll need Sai. Done, Danzo said immediately. Kakashi-senpai hadn't wanted the seal when they were first experimenting with it, but he'd agree now, if she asked for this, even if she explained how strange it was. 3 of them would make a stable array and was all that was required for the most basic version, but she didn't know if they could take in all of Rain without her being washed away by the dragon. She considered genjutsu experts first, out of habit, even though the seal meant that what they'd need most was power and control rather than expertise. Konohagakure didn't exactly have an excess of genjutsu experts to be had, though, and she wasn't certain she liked the idea of sharing the seal with near strangers. She had the king seal and the balance of power was on her side, but it would be an awkward kind of intimacy. Most were jounin she'd met only in passing or knew only by reputation. It's not just a matter of cooperation, she confessed. There's a seal. Sai already has it, but well, it's not the kind of seal that most people would be comfortable with. We've explored it to a certain extent. She deliberately omitted that the testing had finished only hours before, but we've never field tested it. Tsunade-sama and Danzo exchanged a look. Mitarashi Anko was supposed to be sent on another mission, but we'll transfer her to your squad, Tsunade-sama decided. Mitarashi-san has experience with seals. Sakura remembered the dumpling-coveting sadist that had taken such glee in terrorizing exam candidates. She didn't know how much of it had been a ploy and how much an act, but it had been effective. Even though she'd met the older Kunoichi since then, it was that image that defined her in Sakura's mind. Bold, fearless, ruthless. Also either shamelessly comfortable in her own skin or so uncomfortable in it she compensated by putting all of it on display. It would be useful to have a Hyaga to monitor the situation inside the village, Sakura hesitantly put forward when it became clear that they were waiting for suggestions rather than putting their own candidates forward. Even if he or she isn't willing to take the seal. Tsunade-sama thoughtfully tapped her fingers against the table. You're probably most familiar with Hyaga Niji. His cousin has much better range, but even if she wasn't Eris, I don't think she'd be a good fit for your team. Her personality makes her better suited for defending, which isn't a bad thing to have in the head of a clan. I don't have a problem assigning him to you, but it would be up to you to convince him to take the seal. We're putting most of the qualified Hyaga on Operation Watchtower, monitoring battlefield conditions in real time for my commanders, but I can spare someone. Niji-san will be fine, Sakura said uncomfortably, the consideration a reminder that she wasn't just a little gear in this engine of war. Her team was the key that would turn the whole thing over. Kill your heroes. Chapter 64. Torche Loose Panique, Part I. Sakura had been honored in her inclusion in Tsunade-sama's shadow guard, now she wished that they'd have left her at home if this was where the path led anyway. They had given her a ready room of her own, put a researcher at her disposal, this in addition to the files buttressing a number of blueprints and scrolls that had been waiting for her, and given her a travel timeline that would have killed a genin. Because she was alone, she wasn't ashamed to face one of the walls and press her forehead against the cool surface, fingers digging against the flat surface like she was clinging to a sheer cliff face. Her stomach roiled, clenched tight with anxiety, and she couldn't blame the sweat that prickled along her spine on the stifling room with its single sluggish fan. Sakura had never had any ambition of eclipsing the reputation of the foxwife, just a firm resolution to live as long as she could and lose as few people as she could manage. Some days, even that felt like too much. Even if she'd had that kind of ambition, the foxwife had reigned in the fields and the forests, fighting against enemy shinobi. Perhaps they weren't samurai with their honor codes and their ethos of service, or the valiant farmer soldiers with which the daimyo fought their wars, but they too shared understandings that crossed cultures and borders. Shinobi didn't chase death well, most of them didn't, and maybe all the writing of wills in the world didn't make it real until you were kissing close to it in the field, but they were raised to it. Shaped by it. Those people who died in the foxwife's snare hadn't walked blindly into it. They weren't watching a variety show on television or doing someone's hair, they weren't serving someone unagi no kabayaki or trying to put a fretful child down for a nap. Not that she didn't anticipate their shinobi would also be taken off guard doing just these things, not that she didn't want to catch them unsuspecting in those moments, because that was the whole point, wasn't it, and the whole village had to be aware that reprisal of some kind was to be expected after what had been done to Konohagakure. She had killed all but civilians before, people with more aggression than training. Her very first kills had been like that, though at the time Gato's thugs had been terrifying. She just hadn't killed people who'd done nothing worse than happen to live in the wrong village. The former didn't bother her more than any other kind of death. Once you took up a weapon, it didn't matter if you were any good with it. But for the other, each village had a brand, as it were. A way that trained their shinobi to act and to think of themselves. Konohagakure had more restrictions on services it would provide than any other village. They were the good guys of the shinobi world. Clean and polite, and offering protection for merchant caravans and rescuing abducted women of good families and bringing home lost pets. Witch and Hound specialized in tracking criminals and missing nin and assorted scum of the earth types. This was not that, and Sakura wasn't certain how she was going to live with herself when this was done. Because she wasn't going to fail. She wasn't going to fail, and it was going to shake the world, and her world would tilt so far off its axis that no amount of reconstruction at home would ever return her to the seasons that, while not golden, had been made bearable by Kakashi-senpai and the Ninken and Sude and all her friends, however little she saw them. She would still have those things, but she would always carry the weight of what she was about to do with her, and she did not have the confidence that she would not drown. Like she would make the village of Omegakure drown. It was possible that their civilians had wanted her village to fall. It might even be probable that they'd rejoiced when her village was crushed. She could probably bring herself to hate that faceless mob, could bring herself to bring them to destruction in a way she wouldn't be able to if she thought of them as mothers and daughters and fathers and sons. Maybe true sages had control sufficient to let the rain fall on shinobi but not civilians in a village of thousands, but all her seal could give her was enough chakra to bring down a storm to swallow them all. It hadn't been as hard as it ought to have been to decide on the illusion. It had to be a static illusion, that was to say, that once she'd locked it, the genjutsu wouldn't try to take in their own shinobi when it was time to execute the next phase of the operation. An inability to do this had been the critical weakness of Gozen-san's ultimate genjutsu when the Umbu teams had first been formed, but the field had evolved since the Foxwife's reign. Not so much on scale. Sakura had never even heard stories about other shinobi using genjutsu as Gozen-san had, but in terms of how willing they were to let their comrades attempt to either operate within the genjutsu or break it on their own. Locking it also meant that once an enemy was free of the illusion, the jutsu could no longer sink fresh hooks and pull them back into the dreaming. She had immediately dismissed a slumbering village gambit for that reason. It had been effective in the arena during Orochimaru's invasion because all of his targets were in a relatively contained space that allowed him to kill at will before enough shinobi woke to wake others who would wake others and unravel the illusion before he'd wanted it dissolved. Putting someone to sleep was one of the least chakra-intensive genjutsu, but also one of the most common and by extension, one of the easiest to break. Though shinobi rarely received much in the way of formal training to counter genjutsu in the post-Uchiha age, she wouldn't insult her opponent by underestimating them. Many of her opponents would have been trained while the clan was at the height of their power. Fire was the obvious path to walk. Sakura knew fire like most people knew their lovers. She knew the feel of it against her skin, could conjure with a thought the acrid taste of it in her mouth, could live again at any moment the feel of her chakra boiling her blood in her veins. Fire was the symbol of Konohagakure. Overwhelming destructive power paired with indescribable warmth, ceaseless and deathless so long as that original flame was used to kindle others. But her village had burned. She'd remembered with a sick sort of fury how Akatsuki had turned their strengths against them during the crush and felt it would only be polite to do the same. Aside from the more formal reports she'd been given on Omegakure, she had memories of them from her Chunin exam. They'd taken advantage of puddles and swampy areas with comfort and familiarity, like frogs emerging from the mud. They associated water with safety. With security. Sakura had once taken a walk with Gozen-san to a nearby river, where the older woman had set her to fetching interesting stones for her garden. It had been a little over waist deep, the current languid and summer slow and so clear that she could see the scales of fish glinting in the sunlight. There had only been one illusion at work that day and it hadn't been the drowning. Gozen-san had sabotaged her balance to such an extent she'd felt like she was falling while standing up, and once Gozen-san's bony hand had settled on the back of her head and plunged her beneath the water, it had only gotten worse. The disorientation had fed the panic which had fed the disorientation until she wasn't certain which was up or down and could hardly fight back at all, let alone make an attempt to cancel the genjutsu. She remembered it in vivid, stunning detail, even the slow fogginess of her fading consciousness, to the point that she had developed a severe and irrational dislike of people's hands being near her body where she couldn't see them when she was distracted by something else, even when not anywhere near water. It was why Zen's hands had spent most of the kissing portions of their relationship with their fingers tangled together and pinned behind him. It was why handing Itachi a comb for the first time had felt a little like handing him a knife. Only Kakashi-senpai and, bizarrely enough, Sai had proved exceptions to her aversion. Except when Kakashi-senpai was doing the reading over her shoulder thing, especially if he was actually leaning on her shoulder while doing it, but that was just normal annoyance. It was the thought of something as utterly mundane as being annoyed at Kakashi-senpai that was finally enough for her to peel herself off the wall and return to the table. Which was for the best, because she had a meeting scheduled with Hyaganiji in less than 10 minutes and she didn't want his most recent impression of her to be a gibbering wreck clinging to the wall. Senpai made being a weirdo work for him, but Sakura didn't think she could be so blasé. While it might have been more efficient to summon her team and brief them all at the same time, she'd wanted to give Niji-san an opportunity to reject the seal without an audience. If he said no, which she expected, just as she expected to insult and annoy Sai in the meeting scheduled afterward by attempting to not bluntly ask if he needed a medical exemption from actively participating in the mission. Once it left the village, she'd present it to the rest of the team as being an intentional decision on her part. Not that she didn't expect professionalism from the other three, but well. Kakashi-senpai and Sai were both themselves, and nothing about her impression of Mitarashi-san had indicated she even knew the word restraint. Tsunade-sama had left her with instructions to compile a list of gear that her team needed repaired or replaced and have it sent yesterday, so Sakura spent the time before her appointment mentally reviewing her kit and carefully noting on the form that she'd require open-toed boots and fingerless gloves. She wasn't certain how she felt about showing the dragon to others, but she did know she'd ruin her equipment before the battle even began if she didn't make some concessions for it. She'd finished her list and was dubiously sorting through her mountain of materials when the knock came at the door. "Harano-san," came Niji-san's muffled voice through the door. "Come in," she said, closing her folder and unintentionally mirroring one of Tsunade-sama's favorite poses as she interlocked her fingers in front of her. Tsunade-sama did it to project casual confidence, and because she found it comfortable, Sakura did it so that she wouldn't be constantly fidgeting with the things on the table. "Please, have a seat," she invited him, and once the long-haired shinobi had done so, Sakura took a calming breath and then summarized both the mission and the seal that would make the mission possible. Niji-san had looked very non-committal and professional when he'd stepped inside the room, but by the time she'd finished, he was just blatantly staring. Perhaps she should have been less upfront about the somewhat dubious source of the seal and the less than reassuring way it had become functional, but Sakura had thought it best to be honest about the risk of corruption by natural chakra and other interesting side effects. He trailed off a bit helplessly, then made a visible effort to collect himself, though his voice was still somewhat strained. "So, without supervision of any kind, from the journal of a man who you knew to be having hallucinations and paranoid delusions so severe that he murdered someone. To be fair, it was exposure, a chemical weapon incurred in the line of duty, that caused it," Sakura interjected, but Niji-san continued on undaunted. "You recreated a seal that was used to create massive jutsu arrays by Umbu Team 9, but was apparently non-functional until you channeled so much natural chakra that the rapid cellular mutation killed you. But now it appears to work fine, and the mission that will launch our entire campaign against Omegakure depends upon it." "Yes?" "Those I helped," Sakura said in the long silence that followed. "But you don't need to take the seal if you aren't comfortable with it," she rushed to reassure him. "Given your history with seals, well, I primarily asked for a Hyuga to be assigned to my squad to monitor conditions within the city, not necessarily to include you as one of the seal bearers." "This isn't about the Kago no Tori no Juin," Niji-san said flatly. "This is about you," he trailed off with an inarticulate noise of frustration, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Is this how you'll be proposing this to the other members of your squad?" "Yes." "And you expect them to agree?" "Well, one of them is Kakashi-senpai and the other is Mitarashi Anko-san, so, yes." "Mitarashi Anko," Niji-san muttered. "This keeps getting better." He took a moment to compose himself and then asked, "What are the known risks of the seal?" "Of the seal itself?" "None that we know of, unless you count invasion of privacy. I can sense Sai's location within the village at this distance, but I couldn't tell you what he's doing or what he's thinking. However, using natural chakra is unavoidable in creating a genjutsu of this magnitude, and it does bring on a transformation for me. We haven't tried it to be certain, but it's likely that it would also cause one in the seal bearers. Like Orochimaru's Juinjutsu." Sakura was not particularly fond of the comparison, but it was apt and also the easiest way to explain the effects to someone who had seen one of the cursed seals in use. Niji-san frowned at the table between them for a long time, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. "There's no coercive element to the seal. Because I have the king seal, I'd have open access to your chakra to direct the jutsu, which Sai says feels very strange. He had some success preventing me from accessing his chakra. I'm told that it feels not unlike breaking a genjutsu, so I'd assume with some practice it would be possible to limit my access to sensing only. Maybe not even that. You don't have the same access to my chakra, though I can share it through the bond. I suppose I could theoretically shove an extremely high volume of chakra through the seal as an inducement to do what I want," she said rather dubiously. "It didn't occur to us to attempt to block unwanted sharing, just unwanted taking. By the look on his face, Niji-san had come to some resolution he was unhappy about as he finally looked up to meet her gaze. "I'd like to see it," he said. "The seal?" Sakura asked, unlacing her hands in surprise. He shook his head. "Not just that. The transformation as well. I want to see what the chakra flow looks like." "Oh. Well, that's reasonable," she conceded. Sakura shed her boots and padded around to stand on the side of the table where Niji-san had been sitting and turned her back to him, though it really made no difference once he activated his Byakugan. With a desperate hope that the transformation would subside as easily as it had done when she'd tried this with Sai, Sakura coaxed the pearl of natural chakra in her tanden into blossoming, the strength of it washing through her chakra channels. No more and no less uncomfortable than the growing pains of a child, with almost glacial slowness antlers emerged, toes lengthened, nails thickened, and scales spread across her skin. The transformation occurs faster in correlation to the use of chakra. Yes. Theoretically. Niji-san allowed the transformation to progress to the point where she was glad she'd removed her shoes before he said, "You said the changes reverse themselves." Sakura gratefully spooled the natural chakra back into its rotation and was quietly relieved when the physical changes reverted back to what she'd come to acknowledge as their new default state. "I was much further gone than that when I died," she told Niji-san, rubbing at one of her scaled wrists. "So some of the changes appear to be permanent after the resurrection. Sai's seal mutated to read Komainu, so I don't know whether he'll take those traits or if he'll inherit my source traits. Or what the other seals will read, now that it doesn't use the King Yama, horse head, ox face configuration. So, I'll understand that you won't want to dot." Niji-san held up a hand to forestall her. "You're right to say that I don't want to. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to. Tsunade-sama assigned me to your team, which means that your mission is my mission. And if that mission entails use of experimental seal systems, so be it. It isn't that I don't appreciate the consideration, but this place is my home. Whatever problems I have with the main family, there are more people in my clan than that family and more forces at work than obligation. I died for it for them once. I'd do it again. The chance of scales seems a small price to pay. Then welcome to Operation Cloudburst. Properly, this time. Kill your heroes." Her meeting with Sai went more or less as she'd anticipated, in that she attempted to be diplomatic about the fact that he'd lost part of a limb only weeks ago and in reply had received that particularly blank Sai smile as he thumped a scroll down on the table. That was her only warning before she was bombarded by cats, mewling, and pushing and clawing their way up her shoulders. "What is this?" Sakura spluttered as she pinched a dangling tail to keep it from going up her nose. "A joke," Sai said blandly. "Like the one you just told. Very funny, isn't it?" One of the cats that had been competing for space atop her head took a magnificent leap back toward the table, toppling at least 2 stacks of documents in the process. "Not at all," she said in a very tightly controlled voice as she watched the now loose papers drift into an untidy pile. "And now you know exactly how I feel, hag. I know that I am suddenly feeling much less sensitive and sympathetic. Good. Be reassured that if the order does come to close with the enemy, I intend to follow the example of our friend with the explosive temper and keep to the skies." "That's fantastic, but you do realize that you're going to be the one to pick all those up. Kill your heroes." By the time Mitarashi-san sauntered into the room, Sakura was feeling confident would be overstating it, as there were still some unanswered questions about the new forms of the seals that neither she nor Sai had resolved in the space between their meeting and this one, but she no longer felt like she was in danger of dissolving into a shameful emotional mess in the corner. Sai glanced up at Mitarashi-san briefly from where he was practicing the talismanic script that Sakura still found very difficult to read even in proper lighting. Niji-san had been studying one of the maps of Omegakur, but awarded the new arrival a solemn nod before returning to it. "Well, doesn't this look like a party?" she drawled, one hand coming to rest on a hip, her body set in lines of aggressive lines. Sakura took a moment to study the Takubetsu Jonin, whose dossier had explained that look that Tsunade-sama and Danzo had exchanged before assigning her to the team. Her experience with Orochimaru would likely prove useful, though Sakura was ashamed to admit when she'd seen how long the other kunoichi been working as an instructor at the academy, she'd had that instinctive flinch moment when a field shinobi doubted the competence of a ninja who specialized in teaching. She'd been immediately ashamed of herself, because it wasn't like Mitarashi-san had been completely absent from the field since Orochimaru's defection. The other kunoichi looked much as she had when Sakura had seen her last. Her outfit was a study in contrasts, with a fitted mesh bodysuit that left little to the imagination, and her mini-skirt did more to create dramatic shadows than provide real coverage beneath an enveloping overcoat. It was not something Sakura would have worn short of being given direct orders, but the fashion choices of others were not her business. "Good afternoon, Mitarashi-san," Sakura said diplomatically. Mitarashi-san gave her a casual two-fingered salute, dropping herself into a chair and spreading one arm across the back of it. "Harano Sakura. The last time I saw you was your Chunin exam. For the first part of it you were making calf eyes at the Uchiha brat and doing your level best to slaughter the Kazekige's sister for the second. Still hanging around with Hatake." Sakura grimaced at the reminder that Mitarashi-san's first impression of her had been during what was in hindsight an embarrassing stage in her adolescence. As well as the fact that Niji-san was the closest thing they had to a traditionally restrained personality on this team, everyone else would be quick to say exactly what they were thinking, flattering or not, irrespective of her current position. "Senpai will actually be joining us for this briefing." That drew a laugh from Mitarashi-san. "That sounds like Hatake. Though if I'd known we'd be waiting on him, I'd have stopped at one of the street stalls on the way here. Actually, unless you have a serious objection to it, I'll bring something back while we're waiting for him." "My treat." Sakura smiled wryly. "We actually shouldn't have to wait too long. I might have lied to Senpai about when he was supposed to be here." She raised her voice slightly, "And I can sense you lurking outside the door, Kakashi-senpai, so if you're thinking about slinking off, it's too late." "That's not a very nice thing to do to your senpai, Sakura," Kakashi-senpai said as he entered. "If you didn't do things in your own good time, senpai, I wouldn't do it," Sakura responded dryly. "You wouldn't know what to do with yourself if I was punctual." Sakura raised her brows. "Have fewer white hairs." "Well, it's only fair to repay the favor," Kakashi-senpai said glibly as he chose a seat at the table. "So, Teika, what's the mission?" Sakura sobered then, and with an ease that came from covering it twice already, explained their orders and the seal that would make it possible. Kakashi-senpai, who knew of the seal and her time with Gozen-san, looked half asleep, lids low over his eyes, while Mitarashi-san wore an expression of incredulous disgust. "You know that was dumb as shit, right?" she growled. "Especially attempting to harness natural chakra without sage training. If it was that easy, everybody would do it." Sakura gave a one-shouldered shrug, though nothing about that seal and integrating it had been easy at all. She had provided considerably less detail about it. There were certain things about both that she would only pass on to an inheriting disciple or to Sai, who was bound to her secrets just as much as he was to Danzo's. "Well, at this point, it works, so. And it only killed you that once," Sai added mock helpfully. "Ha. Ha. Ha," she said with sarcastic emphasis. "Are you prepared to be useful? I have some ideas for the seal forms, so if you're prepared to bleed for the ink, then yes." "Hold up, Buttercup. I want to see one of these first," Mitarashi-san objected. "Shirts off." Sakura side-eyed Sai, who shrugged and obediently stood from the table, unzipping the sleeveless vest he was wearing as he made his way over to where Enko was sitting. His torso was crowded with inked animals, but they obligingly shifted to make the seal more distinct. Not that it was truly necessary, they were all inked in unrelieved black and his seal had gone forebodingly crimson. "Yeah, that looks like fantastic fun," Mitarashi-san murmured sarcastically. "Not like something out of a fucking horror movie at all. Or the ugly bastard child of Onmyo-do and Juinjutsu. It just magically read Komeinu all of a sudden when Harano came back up. What kind of?" Her voce dropped lower until it was nigh unintelligible, but the expletive high notes came through clearly. In the end, though, whatever Mitarashi-san thought about the seal, they were going to have to make the attempt. The base ink was the same mixture that Sai used for his animals, but the blood and the chakra that laced it were Sakura's, with 3 drops of Kakashi-senpai's blood to help it bind to him. Senpai elected to have it set on his back between the blades of his shoulders. He did not assume a meditative pose, but rather shucked his shirt, straddled his chair, and settled in with a novel gone positively ragged from reading. The other three watched Sai's progress with nervous eyes. Sakura recognized characters and design elements from their seals as he worked his way inward, but when it came to the central character, Sakura couldn't make out what he was trying to write at all. Mitarashi-san said as much. "I'm not trying to write anything," Sai replied blandly. "Just making certain there's enough ink for this. While we could try to guess what the anchor character should be, I think that activating it will decide it for itself. Give it a minute to dry enough not to smear, but not enough to flake, and it should be ready." Given that her Ryuo seal seemed to have no dormant phase, there was no need to activate it before she settled the fingers of her right hand at the prescribed points on the seal, while her left was folded into the familiar pose of a focusing technique. Kakashi-senpai's skin was very warm beneath her clammy fingers, pale and intermittently freckled with tiny scars. Sakura still wasn't as comfortable with her inner landscape as she should have been. She didn't want to risk the seal failing or hurting Kakashi-senpai, so she took extra care in preparing to activate it. Senpai, for once, held his tongue and allowed her to take as much time as she needed. At last, she was ready. Bridge the chasm, bind the bridge, serve the cause. She fed her chakra into the seal, which grew warm beneath her fingers, the ink turning back to liquid and the black beginning to burn red as her chakra sank beneath Kakashi-senpai's skin. His breath hitched and she knew that he could feel her now. With the exception of genjutsu and medical ninjutsu, most chakra intrusion was uncomfortable, if not outright painful. She and Kakashi-senpai didn't have sufficient similarity in their chakra to be otherwise. This was as far as she and Sai had gone. The Juinjutsu had briefly caught and, like a small child learning to ride a bike without training wheels, had toppled over. Not this time. When she drew her hand away, she brought a little of Kakashi-senpai with her, and as she closed that hand, she knew that sense of him would stay until the bond was intentionally shattered. She hadn't realized that she'd closed her eyes, but it from beneath lowered lids that she read the character that now anchored his part of the seal. Inugami. That made her laugh and pat his head, as he'd done so often to her. Good boy, she praised him. You're going to owe me a back rub for this, he groaned. He hadn't dropped his book, but it was slack in his hands. Poor thing, Sakura crooned, not at all sympathetically, but she was gentle as she experimented with her control of his chakra. Niji-san and Mitarashi-san could worry about coercion all they liked, but Sakura wasn't trained as a puppeteer. Using all of them in a single jutsu would be sufficiently difficult. With the Hokage's permission, she would sever the seal links with the members of her squad she wasn't personally close to as soon the mission was complete. Senpai's as well, if he wished. Kakashi-senpai made an uncomfortable noise as she explored the point where his native chakra overlapped with the ugly, fierce burn of the Sharingan. Remember that I'm a virgin and be gentle, Sakura, he groaned. Just relax, I'll be finished soon enough. Yeah, that's what he said, Mitarashi-san snickered. Are the sexual innuendos really necessary? Niji-san muttered. It feels unprofessional. And uncomfortable. Sakura grimaced. Sorry. Just yes, we can do it without the innuendo. Put your big girl panties on, Hyuga. A little innuendo never hurt anyone. Feel free while you do me, Mitarashi-san said with a grin. Ma, we can play nicely with others, Senpai said. Which Sakura thought was just as well. She was much less comfortable with Mitarashi-san and they applied her seal next. Uebami. Sakura worried at the inside of her lip as she stared at it. Something wrong, Harano? Mitarashi-san asked. I was expecting these to be part of a set, Sakura admitted. With Ryuo at the center, I was thinking more along the lines of the 5 celestial beasts or maybe the animals of the zodiac, but it wasn't that the central character of each seal didn't suit the person that had received it, with the exception of her own Ryuo, but seals the normal, stable sort shouldn't be able to select anything. This had the same dangerous taste as the wildly divergent Sharingan or Orochimaru's Juinjutsu. Self-righteous, uptight, and fantastic eyesight. I'd bet money that Hyuga is going to end up with some kind of bird yokai, Mitarashi-san said as she clasped a hand nonchalantly over her cursed seal of heaven, which was trying to spread tendrils past the suppression technique being used to contain it. Suzuki had always acted as if the activation of the seal was physically painful, which given the massive influx of chakra and rapid cellular mutation that accompanied it, was probably the case. That had certainly been the case with the seal of the false sage, before it had become whatever it was, but Anko's grin never faltered. If anything, it only grew fiercer. There had been enough of a break between the application of Kakashi-senpai's seal and Mitarashi-san's that Sakura had recovered enough chakra to supply the latter without adding in yet another unpredictable element by supplementing her chakra by use of the seal, but she needed more time between Mitarashi-san and Niji-san's. While she was meditating, the others filled out their own parts of the requisitions form or experimented with the new bond between them. Mitarashi-san was especially distracting, like someone yanking on her hair. Eventually, though, she was equal to applying Niji-san's seal. Mitarashi-san would have won, had it been a bet. His central character was Kanjisho, the golden-winged birds who breathed fire and ate dragons and served as the mounts of gods. Kill your heroes. They dismissed for a meal, which Sakura picked at with relentless anxiety. To keep Tatsunade-sama's punishing schedule, they'd be conducting their first tests with her Kanashibari tonight. You shouldn't play with your food, Pakun scolded her. If you don't want it, Sakura-chan, I'll eat it. Baisuke volunteered, which immediately sparked an argument with the rest of the Ninkin. So, Senpai drawled, have you given any thought as to how you are going to say goodbye to your boyfriend? Should I be expecting to sleep somewhere else tonight? Or are you eating out? Senpai. Sakura protested. Yes. Kakashi-senpai responded with contrived innocence. You're going to war. It's perfectly natural to want to take care of certain matters before you go. Though I would like to have him properly over to dinner first. The Ninkin want to meet him. Meet who, bossman? Akino asked, distracted from the rough-and-tumble argument about leftovers by mention of the pack. Uchiha Itake. Though if you're dating, I suppose I could be calling him Itake-kun, ne. Pakun climbed up onto Sakura's lap and addressed her with solemn eyes, Sakura-chan, even if his coat is silky and he smells good, you shouldn't be reckless with your affections. This is my life, Sakura thought wryly. Getting dating advice from a dog. Sakura left off playing with her food to worry Pakun's velvet soft ears. Don't worry. I'm pretty certain that he's holding out for marriage and I don't know if I like him that well yet. Also, we've been dating for like a week. I can't believe that you'd think I'd jump him before we've even gone on our first date, she grumbled, pulling hard enough on Pakun's ears for it to be a reprimand that he grumbled at. Really? Kakashi-senpai said incredulously. Senpai, you were there, Sakura said exasperatedly. Also, you've known me since I was 12. Oh, I wasn't surprised by that. It's the dating with the intention of marriage thing. And they have already discussed sex and it won't be happening until it's on the family register thing. Just what sort of negotiations were involved in this? Let's just say that Itake is about 200% more committed and less conflicted about this relationship. Kakashi-senpai's eyelids dipped dangerously low. You don't want to be dating him. It's not that. Well, not exactly that, Sakura shrugged. You know he's very, very pretty, but he's overwhelmingly polite. Attentive. Observative. Which sounds like something out of a novel, but with a history of being a double agent for longer than I've been a shinobi, there's always a small part of me that feels like, what if this isn't the real Itake? How sincere is he? Is this another long game he's beginning to play? Even if he is really that person, there's also the not-so-insignificant matter of Sasuke. Most of my childhood was spent playing a minor role in his melodrama. I don't want to spend my adult life doing the same. And, well, it's not that I'm not attracted to him. Are you alright, senpai? This is my resigning myself to a talk about real feelings face, when we're already over the monthly quota, Kakashi-senpai replied. Go on. It's senpai and Sakura time, which means uncomfortable topics are allowed. Sakura eyed him warily, but continued. So, Itake. More attractive than Zen, but she searched for the words to describe her feelings. Less comfortable, she settled on. I was never as much myself with Zen as I was with Tatsuo or I am with you, because I saw him so rarely. But Itake, it's not that I don't feel physically safe with him, but he doesn't feel like home, either. Not that it wouldn't be strange if he did, because we don't know each other that well and we haven't spent that kind of time together, but, I want it. That's what I want from a relationship. I am flattered that he likes me and I do like him, but if we can't get to point where I'm as happy to be with him as I am with you, I'd be better off pursuing you, senpai. She nudged him with her foot. If I do have to switch targets, promise you'll let me catch you? She asked sweetly. Kakashi-senpai scoffed. You've known me since you were 12. You know senpai would make you work for it. Sakura laughed, feeling lighter though the situation hadn't changed. So it's safe to say that liking Uchiha Itachi is very complicated. There won't be any 11th hour sleepovers. I'll just have to settle for my usual snuggle buddies instead. This prompted an instant dogpile as the Ninken reassured her that they loved her very much and had no agenda in mind besides plenty of pets. Bull even went so far as to go to the closet and pull out the futons, dragging them with stubborn determination so that they mostly laid side by side, stubby tail waggling so hard that his whole body shook. You know, Kakashi-senpai, if I was chasing you, that doesn't look like much of a gap I'd need to cover. That's like, glomping distance. Kill your heroes. Sakura hesitated for a long moment before Kakashi-senpai dipped his head. She hooked a finger behind the fabric of his mask and pulled it down. Senpai grimaced as she did so, revealing thick canines and other less than omnivorous teeth. If this was 5 years ago, the others would be so jealous, Sakura said as she gently touched his face with hands wreathed in medical chakra. This is the second time I've seen your face, senpai. Because she couldn't resist, one of her hands rose from where she'd laid them against his jaw and traced the furry edge of one large, triangular ear. It flicked away from her attentions and senpai scowled at her. Do we need to have a conversation about bad touching, Sakura? People who use my antlers to tilt my head don't get to object to having their ears handled. You don't even have nerves in your antlers. What are you going to do if you make my tail wag and I lose this towel? You're sitting down, senpai, Sakura retorted dryly. Whether it comes untied or not, so long as you don't stand up, I'm not going to see anything I haven't seen before. I'm going to stop sending natural chakra along the link if you follow the pattern. The changes should reverse themselves completely, though I can't promise there isn't damage to your DNA that we'll see emerge as cancer 10 years from now. Did Sai let you touch his tail? Kakashi-senpai asked as Sakura tracked the rate of his regression. Yes, senpai. Sai let me touch his tail. I did not, however, touch Mitarashi-san's chest scales, if that's where you're going with this conversation. There was a long stretch of silence as his jaw shifted to accommodate human teeth, then, so, did the Hyuga let you touch? Senpai. Kill your heroes. Sakura had sent a note to the Hokage to inform her that they would be conducting tests. The note that had given her the go-ahead had come with a tiny supervisory slug that was presently adhered to her shoulder. They had conducted several experiments without people in the net to establish that Sakura's now eerily expanded Konoshibari could cover the required distance without shattering, but covering forested area occupied by chipmunks and deer was a different beast than keeping human minds caught within the net. Along with her approval and her proxy slug, Tsunade-sama had sent notice to the sentries to expect visitors on the wall and to allow them to work unhindered. Sakura had sent Niji-san to inform the watch captain that they were beginning the test. Her nerves were well past the point of making explanations to strangers. At least Tsunade-sama had also informed the village to expect a genjutsu. She'd weighed the risk of some spy reporting to a megakure against panicking her already stressed population. Sakura regretted the necessity, but better this than going against an enemy village with a technique that only worked in theory. She had taken the highest point in the village so she could look out over the skeleton of the great beast trying to resurrect itself, the iron ribs of half-finished construction projects jutting up into the gloaming. She was tired, they were all tired, and they'd made heavy enough use of natural chakra that she still had the nubs of her antlers. But they were also running out of time. There was no particular reason that their experiment this evening should fail, but neither was there much time for them to correct anything if this fell through. They were scheduled to leave by midday tomorrow so that they could rendezvous with the Suna Puppet Corps team, all of whom needed to be placed before Operation Cloudbreak began. Kakashi-senpai had unilaterally decided they were having breakfast with what had once been Team 7 and Itaka before they left. Sakura was still tempted to pull a Kakashi-senpai and simply not show up, except she was fairly certain the embarrassment of being tracked and delivered by Ninken would be worse than voluntarily appearing. "Is everyone in place?" she asked as she stretched some of the tension from her shoulders. Unfamiliar kit shifted with her as she did so. Their new gear had been delivered earlier today and she wasn't looking forward to breaking in new boots on a run as unforgiving as this one would be. There hadn't been any time for requests to modify the design, though each of the uniforms was custom-tailored for the body shifts that each member of her team underwent when under the influence of natural chakra. Her black boots left her toes exposed, but the integrated shin guards went to well above the knee. Her knife rig fit comfortably over black pants slightly more snugly fitted than Jounin standard, but the fabric left plenty of play so as not to compromise her flexibility. The slim-fitting vest she wore over an equally black shirt was a combination of ceramic plates and mail between layers of Kevlar fabric, with a high reinforced collar. The chain mail was permanently fixed in place, but the plates were the type that were inserted into pockets and could be replaced. It didn't have the plethora of pockets like standard flak jackets, but she was recompensed by several small-capacity sealing scrolls that slotted onto the back of her belt. She had new gauntlets and well-fitted fingerless gloves, as requested, but the hood was new. All of them they'd been issued similar uniforms had long slits in the top to accommodate antlers or ears, but it had a reinforced brim that held it out stiffly from where it latched onto her new mask. She'd been worried that it would compromise her peripheral vision, but there were deep notches cut in the hood at eye level. It was too very sleek and stylized to have been some last-minute creation. Sakura suspected that they were wearing refitted prototypes that had survived the crush. From the masks, she suspected root. Sakura was as deeply uneasy about this mask as she had been about the last one she'd possessed. This one was a featureless black expanse, using some trick of materials so that even the section where she could see through was undistinguishable from the rest when viewed from the outside. It was a uniform designed to make her a faceless weapon and avatar of death. And she could only see that as a mercy of Tsunade-sama, who would immortalize the name of the squad and spare the individuals within it from the notoriety. "Hyaga, in position," Niji-san's voice came across her earpiece. "Ready," came Sai's answer. "Good to go," was Mitarashi-san's reply. "Anytime you're ready, Teiko," senpai said laconically. Sakura was good at was trained for, had lived through fear. That wasn't what she wanted to give to this village, though. So she reached deep in her memories, not so far back as Team 7, but before the crush, before Itake, before Deidara, before Sasori, before so many other painful things. Like a still, sun-warmed stretch of river before it turned into rocks and wild eddies, she remembered movie nights with Senpai and Tatsuo and the Ninken and Sode. She remembered it desperately, fiercely, let herself long for it in the way that her much younger self had longed for Sasuke. The slowly revolving pearl of natural chakra at her core unfurled petals of strength through her meridians and she was generous as she poured it into the bonds that tied her with her squad. There were muffled noises of discomfort as they accepted it, despite the fact that she was filtering it through her seal and her own chakra channels. She was not a true sage. But they would bear it. Different as they all were, each of them was dedicated to this place, to these people, to the idea of Konohagakure. "Then let's give them a pleasant dream," she said and unleashed herself, giving the masses that same sense of belonging, of joy, of peace that she had found in those days. The ghost was all glimmering lights, like 100,000 fireflies, and they blanketed the two black village. What was that saying? The only easy day was yesterday? Sakura was already bone-tired, soul-tired, and today wasn't even yesterday yet and it only got worse from here. Tomorrow she would push herself and then push herself again to arrive in time to do terrible things. Things she did not want to do and would do anyway, because the lives of these people meant more to her than the fear of living with the things she'd do. The Hokage had released the call sign designation of the squad with the arrival of their gear, Fearmonger. Kill your heroes. Chapter 65. Torche Loose Panique, Part 2. Despite his teasing, it was Kakashi who went out to eat that night, relying on one of the several mutual understandings he'd formed during his Umbu days to dispel the restless discomfort that he suspected was a byproduct of channeling natural chakra. Sakura hadn't mentioned it as a possible consequence, but she'd been cultivating that seal for some time and, for all the teasing, there were some things that they just didn't talk about. Until Itake, dating had been one of them, at least in any serious way. Back when she'd been obsessed with Sasuke, he hadn't been invested enough to even bother lecturing her on how it would affect her development. With Tatsuo and Zen she'd done her own thing and his only contribution were author and actor signed copies of her favorite smut series. It was one of the reasons that she'd been able to keep her true activities with Itaka so flawlessly concealed, even from him. She hadn't seemed to want his advice, just to talk, which was just as well. These long-standing connections with a handful of Umbu Kunoichi were as close as he'd ever come to dating. He hadn't had an interest in anything but training in his youth, and by the time he'd gotten around to discovering a man's appetites, he'd already been Umbu. While that already would have made dating difficult, what had made it impossible was his own unwillingness to emotionally attach himself to anyone outside his Ninken. He was hardly alone in that in Umbu, however there were lots of reasons that people couldn't or wouldn't date normally. This was truer for the female members than the male shinobi. Their male partners tended to be less accommodating of someone often not physically present in the relationship or who could be called out on a moment's notice. There was also, he was told, a certain undercurrent of resentment that sometimes cropped up in relationships where the women were higher ranked and higher paid than their partners. Some dealt with it by simply being extremely selective about who they dated, and that usually within the organization. Others who were looking outside or who'd given up looking entirely but were not willing to sleep alone in the meantime often formed loose understandings. Kakashi had been considered handsome, capable, and totally emotionally unavailable, so he'd been a popular choice, was still a popular choice. He only went hungry when outside the village, and that only because he didn't feel that the risk was worth the reward. Even if he'd softened toward the idea that people could and should be something that you wanted in your life, he hadn't had any thoughts of dating. His current arrangement was comfortable. The Ninken and Sakura provided the warmth and comfort of family, and if he wanted sex, he could have it from Kunoichi at the top of their profession. Aside from a desire for a larger apartment, there were 2 humans, 8 dogs, and 1 malicious cat in an apartment where the only putative privacy was in the bathroom. There was no incentive to change his current lifestyle. In other words, he was a terrible source to look to for dating advice. Usually, when something came up that he wasn't feeling up to addressing, if it couldn't be killed, captured, or otherwise physically subdued, he would foist whatever problem it was on the person who happened to nearest that he judged reasonably trustworthy. Somewhere along the way, though, he'd picked up a feeling of obligation about raising Sakura well, which meant he couldn't just present her to one of his acquaintances. Last time he'd done that, they'd given her to Gozen. Kakashi's circle, such as it was a little short on people in happy, stable relationships. And those that were in them might be less than well prepared to address Sakura's specific concerns. Though it was early days yet. Perhaps he should simply hope that the relationship collapsed. He had no overprotective guardian impulses concerning Sakura dating, but, well, if he'd been the one choosing for Sakura, he wouldn't have even looked at Uchiha Itachi. He might be polite and good-looking and from a well-off clan, but he had an entire caravan's worth of baggage. Better that she'd never broken things off with her last boyfriend or decided to pursue someone from the village. The Hyuga clan turned out boys that fell under her type with some regularity, or, better yet, without the nasty business of clan politics. There were surely other long-haired Bishounen to be found in a village this size. Not that he'd intentionally sabotage the relationship. He'd been a presence in his precocious, reckless, anxious Kaoruhe's life since she'd been assigned to him, but his record of raising of all his students had been largely one of non-interference. He was especially attached to Sakura, but hadn't tried to cut off her relationship with Gozen-san, tried to stop her experimental body manipulation, or attempted to circumvent her study of Fuinjutsu. He wouldn't interfere in her choices concerning Itachi, either. Though he was a little annoyed that his Kaoruhe's relationship concerns were muddying what should have been the last peaceful interlude before he intentionally overslept tomorrow's breakfast appointment. He'd noticed that Sakura had managed to inherit the habit of avoiding confrontation in her personal life by avoiding the people in it, but what sort of fun would that be? After she'd stopped being mortified by every innuendo, which by this time were simply habit, he had the moral responsibility to continue building his Kaoruhe's character. It had nothing at all to do with repaying all the anxiety he'd experienced due to the things Sakura got up to every time he left her unsupervised. He met a familiar face on the rooftop, which was his usual route for showing himself out after. Uzuki Yojeo glanced over at him briefly, then returned to staring up at the sky, arms crossed tightly across her chest. She was still in Umbu kit, suggesting she'd just gotten off shift, but though the white vest largely obscured her shape, not even moonlight could help disguise the shadows under her eyes or the gauntness of her cheeks. He hadn't much liked her too red lipstick when she'd started wearing it, as he'd thought it clashed with the natural paleness of her skin and the deep violet of her hair, but now it looked like a grim scarlet slash on her haggard face. Kakashi might not have been in Umbu any longer, and he might not make any effort to keep in contact with his former comrades except the kunoichi he kept company with, but he saw them in public on occasion and read their stories like he read his books. He hadn't seen Uzuki look so wretched since she'd added a second blade to her belt during those ill-fated Chunin exams. Kakashi considered simply waving and going on his way. It was how he'd always dealt with emotionally charged situations in the past. Or the recent past, at least. The Heitake Kakashi who'd had command of Uzuki's Umbu unit hadn't had all his sharp edges worn smooth yet. He tapped his unopened novel against his chin as he wondered what that man would have done. It was probably fair to say that man had been all edges. After everything, he'd come to regard the sticky kind of emotions as voluntarily walking into a tar pit. If you didn't particularly care for anyone, no one could hurt you. He'd been vicious, like an abused dog, until he'd been sick of it, and the third had decided that rather than hoping he'd form bonds among his equals, as Minato-sensei had thought best, it would be better for him to take care of more fragile things. Helping to raise small humans into deadlier large humans was apparently a healing experience. Kakashi had some deep reservations about the validity of this, but, well, actionable concern was a new sort of thing for him. He'd saved people out of calculation and bartered for favors and been useful to others on the strong suggestion of his cage, and regularly held doors for little old ladies because he wasn't that miserable of a human being, but something as simple as asking how someone was, simply because he could? That wasn't something any version of Heitake Kakashi had much practiced. Yo! Yojao-chan! He greeted her, which startled the kunoichi enough that her arms dropped from their defensive position as she turned toward him. He didn't know whether the long pause was simple surprise or if she had to decide what to call him. She settled on saying coolly, "Heitake-senpai. I didn't even know you knew what my given name was." "Don't be like that, Yojao-chan. I had access to your personnel files for years." There was a flat, unamused look to her eyes. "Did you need something, senpai? Can't I say hello to an old teammate without being suspicious? You can pretend to be harmless all you like, but don't forget that I knew you before." Kakashi allowed himself to wince dramatically, though the harsh lines of Uzuki's expression didn't soften. That was unlike the her that he'd known, though admittedly it would be overstepping to think he'd known her well. Heitake Kakashi had met her respectful work self when she had first been assigned to him. Time had somewhat tempered her eager correctness, but she'd always been like the art she practiced. Straightforward, passionate, committed. Her kenjutsu and her sensory skills had been sufficient to see her actively recruited into Umbu, where the ratio of men to women was skewed to something like 17-1. She had been born with talent that had been carefully tempered during her childhood and honed to a rare sharpness during her time in his team. He imagined that she'd only improved in the years since then. Ma, don't be like that," he said, sidling closer until he was looking up at the same patch of sky that had drawn her focus. He wasn't certain what other people saw there when they looked up that captured their attention. Whatever lies he told, he did not watch the moon or clouds or flowers blooming. For him, they were just useful. He could navigate with the night sky, read the weather in the clouds, track an enemy through crushed foliage. None of these were sufficient distraction in their mere existence to keep him safe from the dead. For that, he needed the other worlds in books, where he could discard himself and be carried along by someone else's existence, flowing smoothly over obstacles to a sticky sweet ending. Whatever Uzuki normally sought when she stared up at the moon, she clearly wasn't finding it now. He could make a reasonable guess at what had disturbed her peace of mind. So, what did Hayate have to say? Uzuki jolted like he'd backhanded her. Something to the effect that the dead shouldn't be chains on the living. "How dare," she began, but he continued on undaunted. "Because that's what Rin wanted to say to me. Or, at least, that was what she said she'd wanted to tell me for years, although she also told me that she'd been proud of me. Apparently, she'd had confidence all along that an old dog can learn new tricks. Is it all right to tell me that?" Uzuki no. He might as well think of her as Yojao-chan, he wasn't her captain any longer, asked cautiously. You never talk about your first team. Talked about your first team, she corrected herself. He glanced over at her, reading in her body language the suspicion she wasn't bothering to hide. Yojeo-chan did not trust that this wasn't a calculated vulnerability, that he wasn't maneuvering her into some favor she would not want to do. It was true enough, in its own way. Kakashi was silent, patiently waiting with hands harmlessly in pockets as Yojeo-chan decided what to do with what he'd told her. She jerked her gaze away from him, staring stonily at the moon. Kakashi hummed thoughtfully, surprised by how relatively painless the admission had been. Part of that was probably healing, like scar tissue formed over a wound finally beginning to heal over. Part of it was probably that Yojeo-chan stood at the perfect emotional distance. He had worked with her for years and as such trusted her. She was an adult with a well-developed sense of self, grounded and confident in her own power, competent and powerful in her workplace. The balance of power between them was comfortable, and whatever heavy things they spoke about in the moonlight weren't things they'd be confronted during their workplace hours. Yojeo-chan must have thought so as well. You're right, she conceded. Grudgingly. Height told me that he was proud of me. For how far I'd come in the two sword styles I took up after he died, and for my dedication to my original style. And that he was moved by how much he'd meant to me. But he also said that I was too young to grieve for the rest of my life. That instead of just chasing perfection with the sword, I should also make an effort at pursuing happiness. He said, her breath caught, he said that he had chosen to be reborn. Height doesn't have any living family to watch over. Just me. And he said that I don't need him. Damn him, she muttered forcefully, because he knows that I can't begrudge him that. He was already dying when they killed him. That was why he was proctoring that exam in the first place. They wouldn't give him leave for fieldwork anymore. Kakashi was not surprised by that admission. Gecko Height could have been tracked through the village with that awful cough and hadn't looked well for years, which meant it was something that the medic nin couldn't treat. So I've been dumped by a dead man, Height-senpai, Yojeo-chan said bitterly. Does that answer your curiosity? If Yojeo-chan had been Sakura, this would have been the moment for a reassuring head pat. He wasn't certain Yojeo-chan wouldn't attempt to remove his hand from his wrist. Instead, he offered her a secret of his own, though proffering it was selfishly motivated. Of all the files he had read, there was one he'd never worked up the courage to open, and now it was likely too late. Back when I wasn't talking about my first team and you weren't asking questions, did you ever access the files on the attempted retrieval of Uchiha Obito's body? Kill your heroes. Sakura suffered through the nightmare with the resignation of someone who had them often. In this one, the Hokage had not stopped with the genjutsu, had instead, once she had discovered the seal, given Sakura enough seal bearers for a ninjutsu, and this Sakura had chosen fire. She had never seen the like of the fire that Dream Self brought down so much heat that it warped the very air, turning it into a vortex that roared with a sound that drowned out thought. The proud towers that she knew from surveillance photos warped and collapsed as the fire that had become a thing unto itself that snatched away the dying sounds of an entire population and spun them up into the sky, where it was boiling away the clouds. Sakura's long, sinuous body was buffeted by the winds she'd created, the pink mane that crested her length snapping like a banner. Translucent inner eyelids meant that she didn't have to look away, even for a moment, and she thought she began to see a shape forming in the haze of heat. She never discovered what it was. Her alarm chirped and she jolted into wakefulness, instantly uncomfortable as her body was tacky with cold sweat and she had too many furry companions piled atop her for the heat to dissipate. Sakura rose and shed animals as she did so, most of which simply shifted into the warm spot left by her body. Sode simply oozed out across the section of pillow he'd been allowing her to occupy, smugly lidded eyes gleaming faintly in the dim room. Sakura patted her way to the bathroom, glancing briefly over at Kakashi-senpai, who'd come in unusually late the night before. She'd guessed he'd oversleep their meeting, but that had been an unnecessarily touch. Though it had worked, she wasn't going to disturb him. She didn't bother showering yet, simply made use of the facilities, brushed her teeth, scraped her hair out of her face, and slipped into her running gear. Ready to go out. She whispered as she emerged, which immediately had the room seething quietly around her shins. She paused only to collect her kit from where it was waiting next to her futon. Sode made a condescending sort of motion with his tail that might have been waving goodbye. The group grew more boisterous almost the instant the door shut behind them, though they obediently used their indoor voices until they made it outside. Necessity had limited their walks for the past weeks, so the Ninken were rambunctious and apparently immune to performance anxiety, bounding through the streets. Rubble became obstacle courses and they tried to outdo each other, playfully attempting to trip each other and Sakura as they made their way past several checkpoints to the cage monument. It was probably a vague abuse of the gate pass she'd been issued with her mission, but Sakura wanted to say goodbye to her village properly. To watch the first light of dawn spill over the horizon and wait for the determined spirit of her people to rouse them for another day of make the best of what they had. It reminded her strongly of Wave, only she had grown well beyond that little girl's disgust, saw instead the warmth of the open-handed kindness both groups had adopted in the face of adversity. She wouldn't pretend that there weren't little pockets of darkness hidden from her sight. It was impossible for this many people to all be good people at their core, but there were sufficient people engaged in being actively good that it more than counterbalanced those industriously involved in securing their own self-interest. Sakura admired them, those people who chose, day after day, without orders of any kind, to practice what she'd come to think of as practical kindness. As she settled herself comfortably in the second Hokage's hair, warm bodies pressing tightly against her, Sakura spitefully summoned Sode, who yelled, "Unhand me, you!" "Hush," she told him, hugging him to her chest. "We're having a moment." After some disgruntled wriggling, he said in a put-upon voice. "Very well. If you must. When this war is over," she said softly as the overcast sky began to light with streaks of color, "let's go back to Wave." "Any particular reason?" Pakun asked. "Sometimes you want to be reminded that you help build things, communities, and not just break them." Wave was also a beginning for her, a place of many firsts, and going back would be a little like coming full circle. "Then we'll do that," the little pug said agreeably, and that was that. Kill your heroes. Sakura had finished her gear check the night before, so there was no need to do anything further that morning than shower and dress. Time constraints meant that they would leave directly after the breakfast, so she wasn't wearing civvies. Shinobi in full uniform had become utterly unremarkable after the crush, though Konohagakure uniforms did not usually look quite like this. Even with the hood down and the mask sealed in a scroll, her new uniform made the reflection staring back at her from the mirror look somber. Stark. Deadly. She'd braided her hair before pinning it up, then did her best to set it in stone with product. Sakura hated when tendrils worked themselves loose and clung to her face beneath a mask. Even chakra had its limitations when it came to sweat. With the hood up, she half expected her hair to look like she'd been swimming when it came time to take it down. Fingers ghosting over her kit in one final check that everything was present and secured, Sakura eyed the still sleeping Kakashi senpai and decided that she'd let sleeping dogs lie. Although some restaurants had managed to reopen in the form of open-air food stalls, Suzuki was under house arrest, which limited their options to the apartment he and his brother were currently sharing. There was a certain soulless sameness to the quickly constructed apartment buildings that were currently housing Kohoha's Shinobi. The hall that led to this apartment might well have been the same one she'd just left. Sakura rapped briskly on the door with her knuckles. It was Suzuki who opened the door, pausing in the frame long enough she thought that they were about to begin their breakfast with another argument. But there was something different in his expression as he studied her, something softer around his eyes and mouth. "Well, you might as well come in," he said. "The idiot's already here." And he was taller again than she'd last seen him, she thought, though it was hard to say with the way he was sprawled next to the table. "Sakura-chan," Naruto said, bounding up to greet her. "What are you wearing?" he asked even as he unceremoniously gathered her in a hug. Too bewildered at his sudden proximity to return the gesture, she had not remembered them being on hugging terms last she saw him. Sakura only patted his elbows gingerly before stepping back out of his embrace. "A uniform," she replied. "What about you? Someone finally talk you into burning that tracksuit?" Naruto laughed, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. "One of my teammates pointed out that it looked maybe less than professional, and if I wanted to be taken seriously, maybe I should stop dressing like I was 12. Despite the exuberance of his greeting, there was a different feel to Naruto as he settled back down by the table. As if there was a balance to him that hadn't been there before, like someone had finally filed down the edges of his manic energy. She wondered if these were the fruits of sage training or if it was simply the fact that for this one brief hour all the members of Team 7 would be under one roof without express plans to kill one another. "Why are we hugging?" she asked. "Then, did you hug Sasuke?" "Because you don't look injured." Itachi was watching. Sasuke grumbled as he took his own seat at the table. Naruto grinned at them both. "I've missed this," he said. "Even though it's been so long it almost feels like a different lifetime and maybe we're almost different people, I'm still just..." He shook his head then, giving up on finding the right words to express himself, but what he intended to say was obvious. He was glad that his team was home. "Now we're just missing Kakashi-sensei, but to be honest, it feels more like a reunion if he's late for it," Naruto said. "He was asleep when I left the apartment." Sakura volunteered as she eyed the table like a potential battlefield and decided to take one of the narrow ends since Naruto and Sasuke had each claimed a long side and were taking up more space than was strictly polite in a small space like this one, though she would see if Itachi needed anything in the kitchen before she sat. "Where's your team? I thought they were supposed to be here for this." "Change of plans," was Sasuke's gruff explanation. Sakura hummed thoughtfully, then made a very brief foray to the kitchen, where Itachi turned her out to wait at the table again. She settled herself neatly on one of the zabuton and took in the two boys, almost men now, she supposed, that shared the space with her. Sasuke was no longer wearing his attire from his time with Orochimaru, though he hadn't adopted the Konohagakure uniform either. As for Naruto, his hair was longer than she'd ever seen him wear it. Cutting it likely hadn't been a priority during his sage training, and as puberty had begun to cut angles into a face that previously had a child's roundness, she saw the ghost of his father. Seeing her looking, Naruto smiled at her. "So," he drawled leadingly, "I hear you're dating Sasuke's brother. You discover Uchiha Itachi is alive, has been a double agent all along, and what you focus on is that we're dating. How did you even hear about that?" "Pervy Sage has priorities and he was the one they had debrief me," was Naruto's glib reply. Sakura muttered, "I'm surprised that he didn't just tell you that we were having a team breakfast and let you walk in without telling you anything. He did say that Granny was the one who told him that there were surprises and then there were surprises and that maybe they ought to tell me about this one before this asshole and I create more property damage than Konohagakure really needs right now." Sasuke sneered briefly at Naruto. "Since you didn't manage to drag me back, does that mean you can't be Hokage now?" "I vaguely remember a speech to that effect." Once, Naruto would have lashed back first with words, shortly thereafter with fists. But this new, grown-up Naruto just shakes his head at Sasuke. "Guess not," he says with a rueful grin. "But maybe it's for the best. Have you seen the sort of paperwork that the Hokage has to do? And the budgeting? In the academy, they tell you that the Hokage is the strongest shinobi, the leader that everyone looks up to, but all the things they didn't tell are all very good reasons and not failing to bring your sorry ass back that it's not something I want to chase any longer. I don't need a title to have everyone acknowledge my strength. If it comes down to it, I think I'd really like to be a teacher, after a few more years in the field," Naruto said thoughtfully. "Do for others what Iruka-sensei did for me. After all, what I'm really good at is believing in people." That's actually a really good analysis of your skills and ambitions," Sakura said. "Well, sage training might sound glamorous, but it's not just technical skills. It's mostly thinking. A way of seeing the world. And you can't understand the world and all the forces in it if you don't understand yourself." She told herself that she was going to have to stop being surprised by Naruto, one of these days. He was no longer that loud-mouthed little boy from the academy, any more than she's that girl whose whole world revolved around Sasuke. As for Sasuke, well, they'd see. Kill your heroes. No one died during their breakfast, and while there were significant tensions between them still, Sakura sensed that small, tentative steps had been made toward something. She still wouldn't trust Sasuke to so much as watch her cat, but they weren't angry children any longer. Sakura could and would cooperate with him, regardless of her own feelings, so long as her village required it of her. Those were the burdens of adulthood, whose much dreamed of freedoms were largely illusions. It had made her slightly thoughtful and introspective and also a little bold, though that last might have been the result of the war that loomed so large she couldn't see a future beyond it. "I'm going to kiss you, because it would be a shame not to have kissed you at least once, she said as she slid her hands down Ataka's forearms to tangle his fingers with hers and used that point of contact to gently back him against the wall of his apartment building, where they were largely out of sight. But, Ataka? Yes. He asked as he waited for her with an expression of infinite patience and a flush riding high on the ridge of his ears. I think I want someone to choose me first, she confessed softly. Wholeheartedly. Unreservedly. I think I deserve that. And I think that you deserve the same. I'm not making this an ultimatum, because that would be an ugly thing to do before going somewhere I might never come back from, but I want to say it. If we can't be that to each other, then we need look elsewhere, he finished for her. Sorry, for choosing now to say this. But I think it would be easy, for me to settle. And I don't want to. And just now I wasn't afraid to say it. So it had to be said. I understand, he replied softly, his head tilting down so that their foreheads were pressed together. I want you to be able to tell me what you need without fear, he said. This isn't something that I'm much practiced in, but I do know enough about relationships to know that it's the things that people don't say that usually sours them. And here humor crept back into his voice, despite popular opinion, the Sherry Non does not actually allow me to read minds. I hear he hesitated, don't know that is a promise I can freely make at this moment. Suzuki still I will think on it, he promised. And if it's something I cannot give you, when we are finished with what must be done, I will let you free. Even when I want to lie and keep you close. So, for now, won't you kiss me? She did. Check the description for the links to the author.